Don't you touch her. The words came out of Cole Kincaid's mouth before he even knew he'd stood up. 6 feet 2 inches of road-worn leather and 30 years of hard living, and he was already moving across that diner floor before his brain caught up with his body. Because what he'd just seen, what every single person in that room had just seen, wasn't something a man sat still for. Not a real man, not any kind of man worth the air he breathed. If you've ever witnessed a moment that split your life into before and after, you know exactly what this story's about. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The breakfast rush at Millie's Corner Diner started at 6:15 every morning and didn't let up until 10:30, and Alora Whitmore had learned to move through it the way water moves through rock, not by force, but by finding every crack and working it until she got through to the other side. She'd been doing double shifts for 11 weeks straight by the time the Thursday in question rolled around, and her feet knew the layout of that diner the way her hands knew the shape of James's dog tags by feel alone in the dark without thinking. She wore the tags every shift. She'd worn them every day since the officer showed up at her door in dress blues with his hat in his hands and his mouth already forming the words she'd known were coming from the moment she saw the car. Sergeant James Whitmore, United States Marine Corps, killed in a non-combat vehicle accident outside of Mosul 14 months after his second tour in Iraq. 14 months of thinking the worst was behind them. 14 months of video calls and care packages and a pregnancy test she'd taken alone in the bathroom of this very diner because she'd been afraid to wait until she got home. The tag sat against her sternum, now tucked inside her uniform top, cool and solid and real in a way that very little else in her life felt anymore. Alora Table 6 needs a refill. That was Donna, the morning manager, calling from behind the counter without looking up from the register. Donna was 53 and had been working at Millie's since before Laura was born and had exactly zero patience for anything that slowed down service. She wasn't cruel about it. She was just efficient in the way that people become efficient when they've spent decades surviving on tips and goodwill and not much else. "I've got it," Alora said, and she grabbed the coffee pot and moved. 7 months, that was where she was. 7 months along, and she was still pulling doubles, still fitting into the modified uniform Donna had let her piece together from 2 sizes up, plus an apron that tied loose still on her feet for 9 and 10 hours at a stretch, because the alternative was not eating. The baby moved sometimes when she stood too long, a rolling shift of pressure low in her belly, like the child was rearranging itself, making its displeasure known. She'd started talking to those movements in her head. "I know, baby. I know. Just a little longer." The medical bills were a problem she dealt with by not looking at them directly, the same way you don't look directly at the sun. She knew approximately what she owed. She knew the VA had processed some of James's benefits, but the survivor's benefit was slower than the paperwork said it would be, and the hospital required payment up front for prenatal visits above a certain threshold. And her landlord, a man named Gerald Potts, who she'd always found vaguely unpleasant, had raised her rent by $200 in January and hadn't apologized for it. Gerald Potts owned a lot of properties in Kellner Creek, Tennessee, most of the rental units in town if she was being honest with herself, and the laundromat on 5th, and the parking lot behind the pharmacy. Gerald Potts did not, however, own Millie's Corner Diner. Millie had him, who was 81 and lived above the diner, and came down every morning at 8 to sit at the counter and drink 1 cup of coffee and read the paper owned Millie's. Millie had told Alora 3 weeks after James died that her job would be there as long as she needed it, and had said it in that flat, factual way that old Southern women sometimes say the most important things without ceremony, without sentiment, just as a statement of what was going to be true. Alora had cried in the walk-in freezer for 6 minutes after that conversation, and then come back out and finished her shift. She refilled the coffee at Table 6-2, retired school teachers, who came in every Thursday, always ordered the same thing, always tipped exactly 15%, and always said thank you, like they meant it, and was turning back toward the counter when the bell above the door chimed. She didn't look up right away. The bell chimed 50, 60 times a shift. You stopped registering it as a specific thing after a while and just let it exist as background sound, the way you stopped hearing the hiss of the coffee maker or the intermittent clang from the kitchen. But then she heard it, the second sound, the one that came right behind the bell. Engines, not 1, not 2, The low layered thunder of multiple motorcycles cutting out in sequence the way a line of them does when they park one, then another, each one dropping to silence a beat apart like a sentence, with real weight being spoken one word at a time. She looked up then. 6 of them came through the door. Big men, all of them, wearing the kind of road-worn leather that takes years to get right, the kind of wear that can't be bought at a store and can't be faked. Their cuts, the vest-style jackets that served as their colors, were black heavy and unambiguous. White patch on the back, red lettering. She didn't need to read it. She'd seen that patch before in a context she hadn't expected and had never forgotten. They moved into the diner the way men move when they're used to people making room for them. Not aggressively, not performatively, just with the simple understanding that space would be provided. And it was. The 2 guys from the hardware company who'd been taking up the corner booth gathered their plates and their coffees and relocated to the counter without being asked. The bikers settled in, all 6 of them, filling the booth and pulling a chair from a nearby table for the 6th man. The one who sat at the corner of the booth with a clear line of sight to both the door and the counter was the one Alora noticed most. He was maybe late 40s or early 50s, with gray working its way through dark hair that he wore pushed back from his face and a beard that was neatly trimmed in a way that seemed incongruous with everything else about him. He had the kind of face that had been weathered by something more specific than just time, the face of a man who had made difficult decisions and lived with them without apology. His arms, resting on the table, were covered in tattoos that told stories she couldn't read from across the room. He caught her looking. He didn't smile exactly. He just held the look for a second, the way you do when you want someone to know they've been seen, and then he looked down at the menu. Alora went to take their order. "Morning," she said, pulling her pad. "Coffee to start." "Please," said the gray-haired one. The others nodded. His voice was deeper than she'd expected, measured, with a southern drawl underneath it that had been flattened by years of traveling elsewhere. "What's good here?" "Biscuits and gravy are made fresh every morning. Eggs are never frozen. If you're hungry, the lumberjack platter is the move, but I'll warn you, it's not a small plate." He nodded slowly. "What do you recommend?" She paused for half a second because customers almost never asked her that, and she'd gotten so used to reciting options that the question felt slightly off script. "The biscuits," she said. "Honest answer. Millie makes them herself, and she's been making them for 60 years, and she's still better at it than anyone I've ever met." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something adjacent to it. "Biscuits it is, for the table." She wrote it down, took the rest of the orders. Some wanted eggs. One man wanted nothing but black coffee and toast, and went back to the kitchen. She heard them talking behind her low, and even the kind of conversation that happens between people who've known each other long enough that they don't need volume. She didn't try to listen. The morning moved the way mornings did. The retired teachers finished and left. A family with 2 kids came in and sat by the window. The hardware guys eventually left the counter and headed back to work. Alora moved from table to table, refilling, collecting, smiling at the people who smiled, nodding at the ones who didn't, keeping her feet moving, because if she stopped and stood still for more than a few seconds, the ache in her lower back became a specific, pointed thing that she didn't have the luxury of paying attention to. She was at the counter checking on an order when Donna appeared next to her. "You see who just came in," Donna said very quietly. Alora glanced up. "Came in a while ago. They ordered biscuits." "Not them." Donna's voice had changed in a subtle way, a slight tightening, a conscious flatness. "Him." The bell chimed. Alora turned. The man who walked in wore a gray suit that fit the way expensive things fit, like it had been made specifically for the body inside it, with no compromises. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, with silver hair combed back sharply, and a face that was handsome in the way that some predatory things are handsome, all clean lines and cold geometry. He wore no tie. The top button of his shirt was open, and somehow that detail felt deliberate, like everything about him was calculated for effect. He was not alone. 2 men followed him, and both younger, both wearing the kind of casual clothes that still managed to signal money: dark slacks, collared shirts. The kind of shoes that cost as much as Alora's monthly rent. They move the way men move when they're paid to be adjacent to someone important. Slightly behind, slightly alert. Watching the room without looking like they were watching the room. Victor Castellano. She knew the name. Everyone in Kellner Creek knew the name. He'd been operating in the county for about 4 years, acquiring property, investing in businesses, or appearing to invest in businesses while quietly maneuvering people into positions of dependence. Gerald Potts, her landlord, had sold 3 of his properties to a company that everyone in town understood was ultimately Castellanos, though the actual ownership moved through 3 different LLCs before you got there. The parking lot behind the pharmacy, a strip of storefronts on Main, the old Waverly building that used to have a community center on the ground floor before it was renovated into something that was described as mixed-use development and that had so far been used for nothing. He scanned the diner the way a man scans a room when he's accustomed to everything in it belonging to him in some sense. And then he walked to the booth nearest the window, the best table in the house, the one with the light in the view, and sat down without asking if it was available. It was as it happened, but he hadn't checked. His 2 companions took a table nearby. Not with him, nearby. Alora took a breath and went to take his order. "Welcome to Millie's," she said, reaching his table pad in hand. "Can I start you with some coffee?" He looked up at her slowly, the way someone looks when they've been waited for and found it acceptable. His eyes moved over her in that particular way that certain men's eyes move, not sexual exactly, but evaluative, taking an inventory. She was used to it in a dull, tired way. She'd been used to it since she was 16. It never stopped being what it was, but you could get used to anything. "How long is the wait for food?" he said. "Shouldn't be more than 10 minutes for anything on the menu. 15 if you want something built." He made a small dismissive sound with the back of his throat. "I have a 9 o'clock. Then I'd recommend something simple. Eggs, toast, coffee. I can have that up in 6 minutes." He looked at her steadily for a moment. Then he said, "What's your name?" "Alora." "Alora." He repeated it the way people repeat words they're testing for usefulness. "That's unusual. My mother thought so." He smiled then. It was a smile she recognized, the kind that was shaped like warmth, but made entirely of something else. "I'll have the eggs. Scrambled. No toast. Black coffee, and I mean actually black. The last place brought me coffee that was still half cream from the pour." "I'll make sure it's right," she said. She turned to go. "And Alora." She stopped, turned back. "Slowly," he said. "I want it done right, not fast." She held his gaze for exactly the length of time that communicated she'd heard him, and then she went to the kitchen. Donna was behind the counter when she came back. "How'd that go?" "Fine," Alora said. "Scrambled black coffee." Donna didn't say anything else, but she watched Victor Castellano's table with the particular expression of someone who's been in a town long enough to know exactly how much trouble a person can cause and has been watching that trouble slowly grow for years. Alora delivered the coffee first. She poured it at the table, which she didn't normally do. Normally, she'd have brought a cup and let people pour from the carafe, but she'd read his energy correctly enough to know that appearing to have prepared it specially would cost her less than the alternative. She set the cup in front of him. He picked it up, drank, set it back down, said nothing. She took that as adequate. The eggs came up 7 minutes later. She'd clocked it, and she brought them out with the same careful, neutral attention she brought to everything. She set the plate in front of him and was already half turned to leave when he spoke. "These are overcooked." She stopped, looked back. The eggs were not overcooked. She knew what overcooked scrambled eggs looked like: dry, rubbery, broken down to granules, and these were not that. These were what the cook made when he was being precise. "I'm sorry they're not to your taste," she said. "I can have them remade. I shouldn't have to ask for them to be right the first time." "You're right. Do you want me to take them back?" "What I want," he said, leaning back in his chair slightly, "is for people to pay attention when I give instructions. I said scrambled, not wet, not dry. Scrambled. That seems like a clear word to me." Across the diner, she was aware in the peripheral way you're aware of things when your attention is pulled tight in one direction that the corner booth had gone quiet. "I understand," she said. "I'll have them redone." "Leave them." He said it sharply, the way you'd speak to someone whose movement annoyed you. "I'll eat what's there. I'm just making an observation." She kept her face neutral. It took more effort than she would have preferred. "Let me know if there's anything else I can get you." She turned. She made it back to the counter. She set her pad down and put both hands flat on the surface for 3 seconds and breathed. "You okay?" Donna asked, not looking up. "Yes," Alora said. "Fine." She went back to work. He called her to the table twice more in the next 20 minutes for things that were not problems. Once to have the coffee cup removed and replaced with a new one. Once to tell her that the napkin was folded incorrectly, which was not a thing she'd previously understood to be a complaint a person could make in a diner in Kellner Creek, Tennessee. Each time she went, each time she managed it, each time she came back to the counter and reset herself. The third time he called her over, Millie was at the counter. 81 years old, small and precise in her movements, with white hair and eyes the color of creek water on a clear day. Millie had him watch Victor Castellano the way a woman watches something she's known for years was going to be a problem and has been bracing herself for the moment it became one. He's going to do something, Millie said quietly when Alora passed her on the way to his table. He's a difficult customer, Alora said. He's not a customer, Millie said. He's a message. Alora didn't have time to parse that before she reached the table. My coffee is cold, Castellano said. It wasn't. She checked the temperature before she'd brought the pot over for a top-off less than 8 minutes ago. But she said, I'll get you a fresh pour, and reached for the cup. His hand closed around her wrist. Not hard, not rough. Just his hand on her wrist, stopping her from picking up the cup. The contact lasted maybe 2 seconds. But the diner felt it. The murmur of conversation dimmed. Not to silence, not yet, but noticeably. The way a room dims when something wrong enters it. Alora looked at his hand on her wrist. Then she looked at his face. I'd like you to take your hand off my arm, she said. She said it quietly and without inflection, the way you say a thing you need to be heard. He let go. He smiled. Just getting your attention. You have it, she said. What do you need? I'm wondering, he said, and his voice had shifted into something more casual, more expansive, like he was settling into a conversation he'd already decided was going to go the way he wanted. How long you been working here? You seem very committed to the role. She picked up the coffee cup. A few years, and they keep you on even now. The pause before even now was precisely calibrated. His eyes moved to her midsection. The silence in the room had spread further. I work the same shifts I always have, she said. Another of those small sounds. That's dedication. I admire that. Really. In a place like this, it must be. Challenging. Financially, I mean. He said it with the smooth, sincere tone of a man expressing concern that was actually nothing of the kind. I'm doing fine, she said. Are you? He tilted his head slightly. Because I happen to know Gerald Potts. He's an associate of mine, and he mentioned that the unit on Clover Street has had some payment irregularities recently. I hope that's not your situation. Alora went very still. The apartment on Clover Street was her apartment. Her name was on the lease. And the fact that Victor Castellano knew her address, knew her landlord, and was sitting in this diner saying this to her face while his associates watched from 2 tables over, that was not an accident. None of this was. My lease is current, she said. Of course it is, he said pleasantly. I'm sure everything is fine. I just like to know the people who work in businesses in this county. I take an interest in people's situations. He glanced down at her stomach again briefly, then back up. In their circumstances. She became aware in that moment of 2 things simultaneously. The first was that her hands were shaking. Not visibly, she'd clenched the coffee pot hard enough that nothing was moving. But internally, the tremor was there deep in the muscles, the kind of shaking that happens before you've consciously admitted to yourself that you're afraid. The second was that the corner booth was very, very quiet. She looked up. All 6 of the bikers were watching Victor Castellano's table. Not with aggression, not with display, just watching the way men watch something they've decided to pay close attention to. The gray-haired one, the one who'd caught her eye earlier, was sitting with both forearms on the table, absolutely still, and his eyes were on Castellano the way a compass needle is on north. Fixed, unwavering. She set the coffee pot down on Castellano's table, not his cup the table, and said, I'll give you a few minutes. And she walked away before he could respond. She made it to the kitchen. She stood with her back to the pass-through and pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and breathed through her nose and did not cry because she was on shift, and crying on shift solved nothing. And she had tried to build herself into the kind of woman who could hold things until she had the privacy to let them go. The cook, a man named Randy, who'd been at Millie's for 16 years, and kept his personal observations largely to himself, looked at her once and said, "You good?" "Yes," she said. He nodded and turned back to the griddle. She was at the pass-through 60 seconds later, picking up an order for table 4. She carried it out. She delivered it. She smiled at the family with the 2 kids who wanted more syrup, and she got the syrup, and she swung back past the corner booth, and one of the bikers, a younger one, broad-shouldered, with a red beard, caught her eye and said quietly, "You need anything, you let us know." She almost missed a step. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way that startled her. At Castellano's table, he was speaking with his 2 associates who had moved to sit with him at some point during her time in the kitchen. She could see him from across the room. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He'd moved on to whatever his actual business was, and she had apparently been nothing more than a brief point of exercise, something to flex against to keep in practice. She felt the fury move through her in a long, slow wave, the way fury does when you've gotten very good at not acting on it. She let it pass. She went back to work. Millie was still at the counter. She watched Alora come around the far side and said without preamble, "That man's company owns the note on the Waverly Building. You know what was in the Waverly Building before he bought it?" "Community center," Alora said. "Community center," Millie confirmed. "And before that, a medical clinic. And before that, a church that fed 200 families every Thanksgiving." She paused. "He buys things and he hollows them out. That's what he does. He makes a shell out of everything he touches." Alora looked at Victor Castellano across the diner. "What does he want with a diner?" Millie's voice was flat. "To own it, or to own enough of what surrounds it that I have no choice but to deal with him eventually." She picked up her coffee cup. "I've been saying no for 4 years. I expect he thought a visit might be more persuasive than a letter." "Are you afraid of him?" Millie considered this. "I've been afraid of harder things than him," she said. "I buried a husband and 2 sons, and this building is still standing. So no, not particularly." She looked at Alora with those creek-water eyes. "But you should be careful, sweetheart. He noticed you." Alora thought about the hand on her wrist, the mention of her address, the look at her stomach. "I know," she said. She refilled her coffee pot and went back to work. It was at the 20-minute mark she'd clocked it later when she'd replayed the whole thing that had happened. She was clearing a table on the far side of the diner stacking plates when she heard Castellano's voice rise slightly. Not loud. He wasn't a loud man, which somehow made it worse. He raised his voice the way someone raises a flag as a signal, not an explosion. "Alora." She set the plates down, crossed the diner, stood at his table. His associates were gone. She hadn't noticed them leave. He was alone, and he'd pushed his plate to the side, and he was looking at her with an expression she recognized now as the one beneath the mask, not the pleasant performative face, but the one that was simply accustomed to getting what it wanted and mildly interested in what would happen if it pushed further. "I've been thinking about what you said," he said. "I said several things," she said. "About your lease being current." He folded his hands on the table. "Here's what I know, Alora. Gerald Potts is 3 months behind on property taxes on 4 of his rental units, including the building where you live. That debt is secured against the properties. If it goes unresolved, which it will because Gerald is not a man who resolves things, then those properties transfer. And whoever takes them on is under no legal obligation to honor the existing lease terms." He said this in the tone of a man reading a weather forecast. Factual. Detached. "I'm not threatening you. I'm simply telling you something you should probably know." She stood very still. She thought about the baby. She thought about the 7 months of prenatal appointments, the charts and the measurements and the small heartbeat on the ultrasound machine, the sound she'd heard alone in the examination room because there was no one to bring. She thought about the lease, which she'd read 3 times and knew was month to month, not annual, which had seemed fine at the time and now felt like a wound. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because I like to know the people and the businesses I'm interested in," he said. "And I'd like to know you, Alora. I'd like to understand what your situation is and whether there are ways that might be mutually beneficial to clarify it." The word mutually sat in the air between them like something that needed to be removed. "I appreciate you sharing that," she said carefully. "I'll look into it." "You do that." He picked up his coffee cup, drank, set it down. And then, as she was turning, he said, "How far along are you?" She stopped. 7 months, she said because it seemed like the least dangerous thing to say. And the father? The diner had gone quiet again. Not completely, there was still the sound of the kitchen, the distant clink of things, but the human noise had dampened the conversations, dropping to near silence the way they had before. The way this room kept doing every time this man sharpened his attention. My husband was a Marine, she said. Sergeant James Whitmore. He was killed in service. A pause. And in that pause, she watched his face not change, which was its own kind of answer about what kind of man he was. I'm sorry for your loss, he said in the tone people use when they are not sorry at all, but know the words are expected. She nodded once, turned, walked. She was 2 tables away when she heard the sound of a chair pushing back. She didn't turn. She kept moving. She was almost to the counter when she heard his footsteps behind her, and then his voice closer now, and the register had changed lower, more personal, the way a voice changes when it's meant only for the person it's directed at. I want you to understand something, he said, just behind her left shoulder. I'm not your enemy. I could be very helpful to a woman in your position, but I need to know that you're someone worth helping. He paused. Think about it. She turned then because she wasn't going to have him at her back. He was very close. Closer than a customer should be to a server, closer than propriety allowed. And she could smell his cologne and see the cold steadiness in his eyes, and she understood in that moment with complete clarity that the story Millie had told her about this man was absolutely true. He didn't want the diner. He wanted to prove he could have it the same way he wanted to prove he could make her afraid. The point was never the acquisition. The point was the demonstration. I'll think about it, she said and made her voice flat and even. He studied her for a moment. Then he smiled, the real version this time, not the performed one, and it was the smile of a man who'd decided the game was more interesting than he'd anticipated. He turned and went back to his table. Alora went to the counter and stood there for a moment and pressed her fingernails into her palm under the edge of the counter where no one could see, and breathed. Alora, Donna's voice, low. I'm fine, Alora said. That's not what I'm going to say. She looked up. Donna was looking toward the corner booth, where the 6 bikers had been having what looked like a quiet, ordinary conversation, but had Alora now registered stopped. They were watching, not Alora, not Castellano's table exactly. They were watching the space between. The gray-haired one had his eyes on her, and when she looked at him, he didn't look away. He held it. And in that look, there was no aggression, no display, nothing performative, just attention. The kind of attention you give something you've decided matters. She looked away first. She didn't know why. She picked up her order pad and went to check on the family by the window. The next 15 minutes were ordinary, or they looked ordinary from outside. Inside, Alora was doing the things she'd become expert at over the past year, managing the distance between what she felt and what her body was doing. Her body was refilling coffee, taking orders, delivering food. What she felt was the particular combination of fear and fury that had no good outlet, the specific exhaustion of being a person who certain men believed they could simply approach and reshape according to their needs. She thought about James. She did that sometimes when she needed steadying, not in a sad way, not a grieving way, but in the way you reach for something solid when the ground is uncertain. James, who had been steady in ways she'd never had to ask for. James, who had in 7 years of marriage never once made her feel small, in the way that Victor Castellano had just spent an hour attempting to make her feel. James, who would have. She stopped that thought where it lived. It was Castellano's voice again, and this time it was louder. This is unacceptable. She turned. He was at his table and he had pushed his coffee cup, the cup she'd refilled not 15 minutes ago, the cup that was demonstrably still mostly full to the edge of the table, and it had tipped and spilled, and she understood in the split second of seeing it that he had pushed it deliberately. The coffee spread across the tablecloth and onto the seat beside him, and he stood making a show of the mess, making sure the room saw. This is what I get for trying to have breakfast in a place like this, he said loudly enough that the room could hear, but not so loudly that it became a scene. He was skilled at this, the volume that humiliates without creating the kind of spectacle that reflects badly on the source. You want to bring me towels, or are you going to stand there? She crossed the diner. She got the towels from the service station. She came back and began cleaning the mess on the table. I didn't push it, he said, standing over her while she worked. That's a structurally deficient table. Someone could get hurt. I'll let management know, she said. You should, you really should. He looked down at her. She was bent slightly, mopping up the coffee, and the position was terrible. The physical awkwardness of being 7 months pregnant and bent over a table while a man stood over her, and he said, how does someone in your condition manage this? All the bending, the carrying, the hours. She straightened. Slowly, her back screamed about it. I manage fine, she said. You're a stubborn woman, he said, and it was meant to sound like a compliment and didn't. I've been watching you all morning. You don't let anything show. I respect that. Is there anything else I can get you? Sit down for a moment, he said. She stared at him. I'm working. Take a break. Sit. I want to talk to you properly. He gestured at the seat across from him with the casual authority of a man who expected the gesture to be obeyed. I can't do that, she said. Can't or won't? Both, she said. The temperature between them changed, barely perceptibly, but she felt it, the slight hardening in his eyes, the small recalibration of his posture. He'd been treating this as sport. She'd just introduced friction into the calculation. I'm going to leave you my card, he said, his voice back to pleasant. And I want you to think seriously about calling me, about your situation, because the offer I'm making has a window, and that window doesn't stay open forever, and I'd hate to see you lose your housing when you're this close to your due date. I'm not going to call you, she said. The pleasant face didn't break. It just deepened somehow, like a mask that was also a face. That's a shame, he said. He reached into his jacket pocket, and she watched him do it, watching his hand, and what he pulled out was not a card, not yet, but a photograph. A photograph that he set on the table face up and slid toward her with 2 fingers. She looked at it. It was a photograph of her apartment building, taken from the street. Taken recently, she could tell by the condition of the rosebush near the entrance, which she'd pruned herself in early spring, and which had grown back to a particular size she recognized. Someone had photographed her building from the street recently. The fury moved through her again. This time it brought something with it that she hadn't expected, that she identified after a half-second delay as terror. Not for herself, for the baby, for the child who hadn't been born yet into a world where men like this one walked around in expensive suits, photographing buildings where pregnant women lived alone. I think you should leave, she said. She said it quietly, clearly, and she watched him hear it. He tilted his head. Monsieur, I beg your pardon. I think you should pay your bill and leave, she said, and I'd like you to take that photograph with you. His eyes shifted. Something moved through them that she couldn't quite name. Not anger, not surprise exactly. Something colder than either. The recalibration she'd felt before, but more pronounced now. You're making a mistake, he said. Maybe, she said, but it's mine to make. She turned to go, and that was when it happened. His hand closed around her arm, not her wrist, this time her arm above the elbow, and he pulled. Not hard enough to hurt, hard enough to turn her back around, hard enough to be undeniable, hard enough for every person in that diner to see. And in the half-second she was turning off balance, she saw his other hand come up. The slap was open-handed, and it caught her on the left side of her face just below the cheekbone. It wasn't hard enough to knock her down. It was hard enough to rock her head sideways, hard enough that she had to take a step to keep her balance, hard enough that she heard the sound of it even as she felt it, the flat crack of palm against skin in a silent room. The diner was completely silent. She stood there with her hand coming up instinctively to the side of her face, and she looked at Victor Castellano, who was standing with the expression of a man who had made a decision and was watching to see what it had cost him. And from the corner booth, 6 chairs scraped the floor simultaneously. No shouting, no cursing, no explosion of noise. Just the unified, deliberate sound of 6 men standing up at the same time with the kind of coordination that comes not from choreography, but from a shared understanding of what the moment required. She felt them before she saw them move, felt the change in the air, the shift in the weight of the room, the way the diner had been holding its breath and now exhaled into something else entirely. Cole Kincaid crossed the floor in 11 steps. She counted them later. She didn't know why she counted them. He stopped 2 feet from Victor Castellano, close enough that Castellano had to tilt his head slightly to maintain eye contact. And he stood there with his hands loose at his sides and his eyes level and absolutely steady, And he said in a voice that was not loud but that reached every corner of that diner, the way the truth sometimes reaches places that speeches can't. You just put your hands on a pregnant Marine widow in front of witnesses. Victor Castellanos' face did something complicated. And for the first time all morning, Alora watched a powerful man realize he was not in control of the room. Victor Castellano had spent 23 years building a particular kind of reputation, the kind that made rooms rearrange themselves before he walked into them, the kind that made men return his calls on the first ring and women look away when he entered, and lawyers find creative interpretations of documents that had seemed clear before his name appeared on them. He had built that reputation deliberately, the way a craftsman builds something meant to last, and he had never once in 23 years stood in a room where the air had turned against him this completely. He stood very still. Cole Kincaid was 2 feet away from him and not moving closer, which was somehow more threatening than if he had. A man who moves towards you in anger is a man you can read. A man who stands perfectly still with his hands loose at his sides and his eyes holding yours without blinking is a man who has already decided what's going to happen and is simply waiting for you to understand it. "I don't know who you think you are," Castellano said. He kept his voice even. He was good at keeping his voice even. "But you're interfering in a private conversation." "That stopped but being private the second you put your hands on her," Cole said. His voice was the same register it had been when he'd ordered biscuits measured on hurried Southern flat. "Everything in this room is a witness now. Every single person in here saw what you did." Castellano's eyes moved, just briefly, around the diner. It was a fast calculation, the kind of calculation a man like him made automatically assessing leverage and risk in the positions of relevant parties. He saw Donna behind the counter standing absolutely still with her hand resting on the phone. He saw Millie at the counter stool, 81 years old, watching him with creekwater eyes that held no fear whatsoever. He saw the family by the window. The father had put himself between his children and the room the way fathers do. He saw Randy the cook visible through the pass-through having come forward to look. He saw the other 5 bikers who had fanned out without appearing to fan out, 2 near the door, 1 near the counter, 1 by the service station, 1 still at the corner booth where he had a clear line of sight to everything. They hadn't drawn together into a group. They'd spread into a perimeter. That was not how civilian men positioned themselves in a confrontation. That was how men positioned themselves who had done this before in contexts where it mattered considerably more than a diner in Tennessee. Castellano's jaw tightened very slightly. "She's a waitress who got emotional," he said. "I was defending myself." Cole didn't blink. "You slapped a pregnant woman who was walking away from you." "I barely touched her." "Your hand made contact with her face." Cole said it the way a man reads a police report, factual, precise, without editorializing. In front of approximately 14 witnesses. "I want to make sure you understand what that means legally, because I'm going to give you the next 20 seconds to think about it before things become significantly more complicated for you." Alora, who had not moved from where she was standing, still with one hand raised partway to her cheek, still processing the distance between what had just happened and what was happening now, watched Victor Castellanos' face do something she had not expected to see. Not break exactly, not collapse, but shift. The smooth, absolute confidence that had been there all morning developed for the first time with a hairline crack. "You're going to regret this," Castellano said. "I doubt it," Cole said. One of Castellano's associates appeared from somewhere. She hadn't seen him re-enter, hadn't realized he'd come back in, and put a hand on Castellano's arm. The associate was younger, maybe 35, and his face had the pale, taut quality of someone who had just read a situation and did not like the reading. "Victor," the associate said quietly. Castellanos shook the hand off. "Don't." "Victor," more urgent this time. A long pause, the kind of pause that is actually a decision being made in real time, all the considerations moving behind a face that had been trained not to show them. Then Castellano straightened his jacket, reached into his pocket, set 2 $50 bills on the nearest table, not his table, just the nearest one, as if the distinction were beneath him, and buttoned the single button of his suit jacket. "This isn't over," he said to Cole. "Most things aren't," Cole said. Castellano walked to the door. His associate followed. The second one materialized from near the restrooms and fell in behind them. The bell chimed, and then they were gone, and the door closed, and the diner held its collective breath for 3 more seconds before someone, the father by the window, let out a long, shaky exhale that broke the silence like a stone through ice. The room came back to itself. Not loudly, not with applause or commentary. People simply began moving again, the way people resume moving after something has passed that they weren't sure would pass. Conversations restarted at low volume. Donna picked up the phone receiver she'd been resting her hand on and set it back down. Cole turned from the door and looked at Alora. She was still standing in the same spot. Her hand had come the rest of the way up to her cheek and was resting there. The side of her face where he'd hit her had gone slightly warm. She could feel the difference in temperature between the two sides of her face, and there was a dull ache at the cheekbone that she knew from basic biology would sharpen over the next hour before it faded. "Come sit down," Cole said. "I'm on shift," she said. "Donna," Cole said without turning. "Can she sit down for a few minutes?" "Alora, sit down," Donna said immediately. "Randy's got the floor." Alora sat down. She chose the nearest chair at the nearest empty table, not because it was the most appropriate choice, but because her legs had decided to make the decision for her, and Cole sat across from her, and one of the other bikers, the young one with the red beard who'd spoken to her earlier, appeared with a glass of ice water and set it in front of her and withdrew without a word. Cole was looking at her with an expression that was not pity. She registered that specifically because pity would have been harder to tolerate than what was actually there, something more like careful assessment, the kind of look a person gives something they want to understand correctly. "How are you feeling?" he said. "I'm fine," she said. He waited. She started again and stopped. The automatic fine that had been her default response to that question for 11 months tried to come out again, and something in the steadiness of his gaze made it stop. "I'm shaken," she said. "I'm angry, and she pressed her lips together. "I'm scared. Not of him, not of what he just did, of what comes after." "Tell me what you mean by that." "He knows where I live," she said. "He told me. He knows my landlord. He had a photograph, an actual photograph of my building. And he told me that the property my apartment is on is in some kind of tax default that's going to result in a transfer, and that whoever takes it over isn't required to honor my lease." She paused. "I don't know if that's true, but men like him don't say things like that unless they're either true or close enough to true that it doesn't matter." Cole nodded slowly. "What's your landlord's name?" "Gerald Potts." Something crossed Cole's face. "I know that name. From around here, from a filing," he said. "We do some work with property records when we're—" He paused, seemed to decide how much context to give. "When we're looking into somebody." Gerald Potts' name came up in connection with Victor Castellano about 8 months ago in a different county. He leaned forward slightly. "How long have you been in that apartment?" 2 years, she said. "Before that, I was on base housing. When his assignment ended, we'd been planning to buy something. We had a plan." She stopped. Let that sentence be what it was. "The plan changed." "What's your name?" Cole said. "Your full name." "Alora Whitmore." Something moved in his face. A very small thing, brief as a shadow there and gone before she could name it. "Whitmore," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with a slightly different quality of attention, not more, not less, but different, the way a focus shifts when a lens has been adjusted. "What unit was your husband with?" he said. She looked at him. "Why?" He reached up and touched the collar of his cut, where she now saw there was a small pin. Not the club colors, something separate, something smaller. A pin she recognized because she had an identical one in a box on her kitchen counter. At home, the box where she kept the things James had sent her from overseas. A Marine Corps Eagle Globe and anchor. Small, worn, the kind that's been handled many times. "I'm a veteran," Cole said simply. "So are 2 of my brothers here. We ask when it matters." She looked at him for a long moment. "1st Battalion, 7th Marines," she said. "He did 2 tours, Iraq. He liked it is the thing. He liked the work, and he liked his unit, and he was good at what he did. He was coming home in 8 months, and we were going to buy a house with a yard because he'd decided our kid was going to grow up being able to dig in dirt whenever they felt like it." She paused. "He died in a vehicle accident, non-combat, 14 months after his 2nd tour ended." Cole said nothing. He didn't offer the standard condolences. He didn't make the face. He just received the information, though where a person receives information that matters with full attention and without performing anything around it. I'm sorry, he said after a moment. He said it the way Castellano had not said it, as if he meant it specifically, not generically. Thank you, she said also specifically. Can I ask you something? She nodded. The dog tags, he said. You're wearing them. Her hand moved involuntarily to her chest, to the place under her shirt where the tags rested. You can see the chain, Cole said quietly. I noticed it when you came to take our order. I wear them every shift, she said. She stopped. There was no good short version of why she wore them, and she didn't have the energy right now for the long version. You don't have to explain it, he said. She let out a breath. Okay. Across the diner, she was aware that things were settling into a new shape, that Millie had left the counter and gone into the back, that Donna was managing the room with her usual efficiency, that the other bikers had returned to their booth and were sitting quietly, and that none of the regular customers appeared traumatized exactly so much as recalibrated. A thing had happened. It had been resolved. Kellner Creek, Tennessee was not a town where that was necessarily a straightforward sequence. Can I ask your name? She said. Cole, he said. Cole Kincaid. She nodded, looked at the glass of ice water, picked it up, held it against her cheek for a moment. The cool pressure against the ache was immediate relief, and then set it back down. He's not going to let this go, she said. Men like him don't. No, Cole agreed. They don't. So I need to know, she paused, measuring the question. What happens now? You were here. You saw it. There are witnesses. But he's going to walk out of here, and by tomorrow it's going to be his version of events against everyone else's, and he has resources I don't have. And I'm 7 months pregnant with no husband and rent that's apparently standing on sand, and she stopped herself, pressed her palms flat on the table. Cole watched this. He watched her stop herself, the conscious effort of it, the way she breathed through it and brought herself back to level. And something in his face changed again, that same subtle shift, but more settled this time, like he'd been working out a question and had arrived at an answer. There's a camera, he said. What? Above the counter. I clocked it when we walked in. It's covering roughly 2/3 of this diner, including the table where he was sitting and the floor space where you were standing when he grabbed you. Cole's voice was completely level. Donna. Donna appeared at his elbow with the speed of someone who had been listening. Yes. Does that camera record to a drive or a cloud system? Cloud, Donna said immediately. I set it up myself 2 years ago after we had a robbery scare. It's rolling 24/7. We're going to need you to pull that footage and secure it before anyone asked you for it, Cole said. Don't let anyone access it, don't delete it, and don't tell anyone outside this room that it exists until I tell you it's time. Donna looked at him for approximately 1 second. Done, she said, and went back behind the counter. Alora watched this exchange. You've done this before, she said. It wasn't a question. Parts of it, Cole said. Which parts? He looked at her steadily. The part where something wrong happens in front of people who can't protect themselves from it, and someone has to step in and make sure the record is accurate. She thought about that. Why, Blaine? Because that's what you do, Kim, he said simply, when you see something that matters. From the corner booth, one of the other bikers, a heavy-set man in his late 40s with a shaved head and the kind of forearms that suggested he'd spent a significant portion of his life doing physical work, stood up and came over. He set his phone on the table in front of Cole, screen up, and Cole looked at it and nodded once. What is it? Alora said. Cole turned the phone toward her. It was a business registration document. 3 businesses all registered to different LLCs with the registered agent for all 3 being the same law firm. And at the bottom of the chain, if you followed the documented ownership trails, was a name she hadn't seen before. But that the biker with the shaved head, he'd introduced himself as Ox with the matter-of-fact brevity of someone who'd been called that for so long, it had replaced the other name indicated with one thick finger. Castellano Holdings, Ox said. That's the parent company for Gerald Potts's rental management operation. Potts thinks he's a landlord. He's actually a property manager for a company he doesn't fully understand that he signed with. Alora stared at the document. So Castellano already owns my building. Not officially, Cole said, but effectively. That's why he knew about the tax default. He's the one creating the conditions for it. That would be consistent with how he operates in other counties, Cole said. He creates a financial pressure, then positions himself as the solution to it. She looked up from the phone. And when I said I wasn't going to call him, he stopped being patient, Cole said. The air between them was dense with the specific weight of a thing being understood for the first time in its full shape. She'd walked into work this morning and thought the day would be like all the days before it, hard, long, manageable, the way hard things become manageable when you have no alternative to managing them. And instead, the day had revealed itself as something that had been building for longer than she knew, a sequence of events with her at the center that she hadn't been aware of, hadn't been warned about, hadn't had any mechanism to prepare for. He targeted me specifically, she said. This wasn't random. No, Cole said. It wasn't. Why me? Because Millie won't sell, Ox said from where he was still standing, and Millie clearly won't be pressured. But her employees, he thought I could be leveraged, Alora said. You're a pregnant widow with financial exposure and no immediate support network, Cole said, and there was nothing brutal in the way he said it. It was simply accurate, and he delivered it as such. On paper, you look like a point of vulnerability. She absorbed this. He was going to use me to get to Millie. Or get Millie to make decisions that cost her, Cole said. Force her to intervene on your behalf in ways that put her at a disadvantage, or watch someone she clearly cares about be squeezed until something gave. He paused. He didn't count on us being here. She looked at him. Why are you here in Kellner Creek, in this diner? Cole was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, she was beginning to read the differences in his silences. This one was the silence of someone deciding how much of the real answer to give. We come through this county periodically, he said. We know some people in the area, and we've been watching Castellano for a while, not just here in a few places. He has a pattern. He paused again. Today was not specifically planned, but it wasn't accidental either. You were watching for something like this. We were aware that this diner was a location of interest, he said, and that the woman who owns it has been refusing to deal with someone who doesn't accept no. Millie, Alora thought. Millie had known. The way she'd spoken about Castellano this morning, too specific, too unsurprised. She hadn't told Alora because Alora had enough. She'd been carrying her own version of this quietly the way Millie carried everything. The fury came back, and this time it had a sharper edge to it because it wasn't just about herself. It was about Millie, who was 81 years old and had buried a husband and 2 sons and still came downstairs every morning and made biscuits, and who had been sitting quietly under the pressure of a man like Victor Castellano without telling anyone who worked for her because she didn't want to add to their load. Alora felt it like a second impact, the understanding that the woman who'd kept her employed and steady for 2 years after James died had been protecting her even as she was being threatened. I need to talk to Millie, Alora said. In a little while, Cole said. Right now, I need you to do something first. What? I need you to make a statement, he said, to the police. Today, before anything else happens, every minute that passes without an official record of what happened in here this morning is a minute Castellano can use to build a different version. She hesitated. Not because she didn't want to, because she'd had, in her experience, a complicated relationship with official processes since James died. The VA paperwork, the benefits, processing, the forms that required other forms, the calls that led to other calls, the way the machinery of official support moved at its own pace, regardless of what the person inside it needed. Official processes had a way of making her feel like a case number rather than a person. His reach, she said. How far does it go into the local department? Cole's expression was careful. We don't know the full picture of that, but I have someone I trust in the county sheriff's office who is not connected to Castellano. I'll make sure the statement goes to him directly. You've already thought this through, she said. I've been thinking it through since about 30 seconds after you walked over to his table the first time, Cole said. Something in that answer hit her in a way she hadn't expected. Not because of what it said about Cole exactly, but because of what it is said about the morning, about the fact that while she'd been moving through it moment to moment, managing each small crisis as it arrived, there had been someone in the corner of the room who was seeing the whole shape of it. That was a thing she hadn't had in 11 months. Someone seeing the whole shape of what was happening to her. She pressed her lips together hard for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, who do I call?" Cole pulled out his phone. Before he could dial, the bell above the door chimed. Everyone in the diner looked up. It wasn't Castellano. It was two women, one in her 30s, one older, who came in and took a table by the window without apparent awareness that anything unusual had just occurred in this room. Alora registered them and felt the slight deflation of an adrenaline system that had been braced for something and received nothing, and she was almost grateful for the interruption. She looked down at her hands. They had stopped shaking. She registered this with something close to satisfaction. The shaking had lasted about 4 minutes total. She was getting better at this. His name is Deputy Marcus Tate, Cole said, sliding a contact up on his phone screen so she could see the number. He's been with the sheriff's department for 12 years, and he's clean. I know this because we looked. You can call him directly, or I can call him and have him come here, which might be faster. Call him, Alora said. I want this done before the end of my shift. Cole stepped away from the table to make the call. Ox remained standing nearby, not intrusively, just there. Present in the way a large man can be present without taking up more space than he owns. You need anything? Ox asked. Food, water. You should eat something. I'm fine, she said, and then caught herself. Actually, yes. Could you ask Randy for a biscuit? Something moved across Ox's face, not quite a smile, but the shape of one. You got it. While Cole was on the phone and Ox was at the counter, Alora sat alone at the table for the first time all morning and let herself be still. She rested one hand on her stomach. The baby moved that rolling pressure, familiar, now the way the child responded to stress by reminding her of its presence. I know, she said quietly. I know. She thought about James. She thought about the way he talked about the men in his unit, not with sentimentality, but with a specific matter-of-fact quality of regard. These are the people who have you, he'd said once, trying to explain something she'd asked about. Not because they're supposed to, because they decided to. That's what makes it different. She looked at Cole's back across the diner. At Ox at the counter, at the other four settled in the corner booth, quiet and watchful. Randy appeared from the kitchen with a biscuit on a small plate, crossed to her table, set it down without a word, and went back to the kitchen. It was warm. The butter was already on it, melting into the split top the way Millie made them. She ate it and felt slightly more human. Cole came back to the table. Tate's on his way, 20 minutes. Good, she said. He's going to want a full account, Cole said. Everything from the moment Castellano came in. Don't leave anything out and don't minimize anything. The hand on your wrist, the photograph of your building, the comments about your housing, all of it. It's all relevant and it's all going to matter. I know how to give a statement, she said, and there was a slight edge to it because she did. She'd given a statement to the Marine Corps when James's accident had been investigated. She knew what official accounts required. Cole registered the edge. Right, he said. Sorry. Don't apologize, she said. You're trying to help. She stopped. It's been a long morning. It has, he said. A brief silence. The diner was almost back to its usual operating rhythm, the clink and murmur and the hiss of the coffee maker. Donna was moving tables with her usual efficiency. The two women who'd come in were being served by Randy, who had apparently taken over floor duties without being asked, which was something he had never done in Alora's memory and which made her feel an entirely different kind of thing. Can I ask you something? She said to Cole. Yes. When you stood up of all six of you, what was that? Was it a decision? Did you talk about it? He considered this. No, he said. We didn't talk about it. Then how did you all, when something is clear, he said, it's clear, and what he did was clear. She looked at him, the gray in his hair, the weathered quality of his face, the pin on his collar. How long were you in? She said. A beat. 8 years, Marine Corps, 2 deployments. When? Late 90s, he said, and 2003. She did the math. 2003, Fallujah. The timeline of James's service. The things James had told her about the men he'd known, the units he'd been adjacent to, the particular brotherhood of that particular moment in that particular war. She almost asked. She stopped herself because she wasn't sure what she was looking for in the answer. It felt like a thread she could pull and wasn't sure where it led. Before she could decide whether to pull it, the door chimed again. This time it was a man in a deputy's uniform, mid-40s, with a trim build and a careful, observant face that swept the room once and landed on Cole before moving to Alora. Cole raised a hand. The deputy crossed to the table. Marcus, Cole said. Cole? The deputy sat without being invited, which suggested familiarity. He looked at Alora. Ms. Whitmore, I'm Deputy Tate. I understand you had an incident this morning. Yes, she said. I want you to take me through it from the beginning, he said. He had a small recorder and he set it on the table. Take your time, as much detail as you can. She looked at the recorder. She looked at Cole, who gave the smallest possible nod. She started talking. She was thorough. She was precise. She left nothing out. The first approach, the comments about her eggs, the hand on her wrist, the questions about James, the photograph of her building the information about the tax default and the lease, the escalating pressure, the deliberate spill of the coffee, the physical positioning, the slap. She said each thing plainly without emotion in her voice, the way you say true things when you need them to be received as true rather than as performance. Tate listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at his recorder, then at her. The camera footage, he said. Cloud-based recording, Cole said. Donna Millett has access. It should capture from roughly 10 minutes before Castellano arrived through the incident. Tate looked at Donna across the room. Donna looked back at him and nodded once. I'm going to need that footage preserved as evidence, Tate said. Already done, Cole said. We flagged it the moment it became relevant. Tate made a note. Then he looked at Alora again. Mr. Whitmore, the tax default situation your attacker described, I want to look into that independently. If what he said is accurate, that's a separate issue, but it's relevant context for understanding what he was attempting this morning. It's not just relevant context, Cole said. It's the mechanism. He's been engineering financial pressure on residential properties in this county to force distressed sales. What he described to Miss Whitmore was not a warning. It was a demonstration of leverage. Tate looked at Cole with the look of a man who is not surprised by the information he's being given, but is noting the precision of how it's being delivered. You've been watching Castellano. For a while, Cole confirmed. In what capacity? The capacity of private citizens who believe in the rule of law and have the resources to pay attention to people who undermine it, Cole said. Tate studied him for a moment. And the footage, the documentation, the property records you apparently have access to, is any of that going to create problems for chain of custody? None of what we provide will be obtained illicitly. All of it will be verifiable from public sources or from sources within the appropriate jurisdiction. What we can do is organize it in ways that would take your department considerably longer to assemble. Another look from Tate, long and assessing. All right, he said finally. He closed his notebook. He looked at Alora. Ms. Whitmore, I want you to know that what you've described constitutes assault in this state. It doesn't matter who the other party is, what his connections are, or what financial interest he has in this county. You have rights here, and I intend to see them treated as such. He paused. Are you and the baby physically okay? The question, the inclusion of the baby in the question, hit her somewhere she hadn't expected. Yes, she said. We're okay. Good. He stood. He handed her a card. Call me directly if anything else happens. Day or night. He went to speak to Donna. Cole watched him go. Alora looked at the card in her hand. She thought about how the morning had started, the usual rhythm, the coffee, the breakfast rush, the particular muscle memory of a shift she'd worked 100 times. She thought about the moment the bell had chimed and Victor Castellano had walked in and how she hadn't known yet what the day was going to be. She thought about the baby, about James, about the plan they'd had that no longer existed, and about the shape of the plan that was now forming around her without her having made it different people, different mechanisms, something she hadn't asked for and couldn't entirely refuse. She was not safe. Not yet. Castellano was gone from the diner, but he was not gone from the county, not gone from the financial machinery he'd built, not gone from the cold calculation she'd seen in his face. Whatever came next was still coming. She knew that with the certainty of a woman who had stopped being naive about what certain men do when they are refused. But for the first time in 11 months, she was not facing it alone. And that was something she hadn't known how much she needed until it was suddenly, unexpectedly, there. Cole sat back across from her at the table. He had his coffee, again. Someone had refilled it, she hadn't seen who. What happens now, she said. He looked at her steadily. Now we make sure you're protected. Housing, medical documentation. We make sure every wall he's been building around you gets accounted for and addressed legally one by one. That takes time, she said. Some of it will take time, he said. Some of it will happen faster than you'd expect. Why, she said. Why are you doing this? All of it. You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Cole was quiet for a moment. No, he said. Not you specifically. She waited. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He looked at something on the table that wasn't there. And then he said, I served with a man named Whitmore once. Not a long time, a few months in 2003 in and around Fallujah. He was junior to me then, just starting out. But there was a day. He stopped, pressed his lips together. There was a day when that man made a decision that cost him something. And the reason I'm sitting here right now, drinking coffee in Tennessee instead of something considerably different, is because of that decision. Alora had gone completely still. Cole looked up at her. I don't know if it's the same man, he said. Whitmore's not an uncommon name. But if it is, and I think it might be, then there's nothing I'm doing for you today that comes close to squaring what I owe. The diner sounds continued around them. The coffee maker, the clink of plates, the murmur of ordinary human life continuing in its ordinary way. Alora's hand went to the dog tags at her chest. She pressed them through the fabric of her shirt, felt their shape, their weight. Tell me his first name, she said. Her voice had gone quiet. The man you served with. Cole looked at her. James, he said. The word hung in the air between them like smoke. After a shot, James and Alora sat with it for a full 3 seconds before she could make her mouth work again. Tell me, she said. That was all. Just those 2 words, but they carried everything inside them. The 11 months of grief, the questions she'd asked the walls of her apartment at 2 a.m, the things about her husband's life that she'd known existed but had never had access to the parts of him that belonged to that world and not to her. Tell me what happened. Cole set his coffee cup down. He wasn't avoiding her eyes. He was gathering something, the right order, the right words, the care that a story like this one deserves when it's being told to the person who has the most right to hear it. We were outside Fallujah, he said. November 2003, I was a staff sergeant running a 4-man team. James was assigned to us temporarily. His unit was rotating. There was a gap. They plugged him in with us for about 6 weeks. He paused. He was 22. He looked younger. He had that way of paying attention to everything that some people have, like he was taking notes on the world and planned to refer back to them later. Alora's throat tightened. That was James. That was exactly James. We were moving through a sector that had been flagged as cleared. Cole continued. It wasn't. There was a building and we'd had bad intel. The kind of bad intel that is generated by people who are either mistaken or being paid to be mistaken. And we went in on a Thursday afternoon thinking we had a routine search ahead of us. He stopped, breathed. We didn't. She waited. There were 3 of them inside, armed position. They'd been there a while. We went in through the ground level, and I went first. I always went first. That was my position, and I cleared the first room and moved to the doorway of the second room, and I didn't see the one on the left because the angle was wrong, and I was moving too fast, and I'd been awake for 21 hours. His jaw tightened slightly. I stepped through that doorway, and the man on my left had me. He had me completely. I had no angle, no cover, no time. The math was finished. The diner moved around them. Plates clanged somewhere in the kitchen. A chair scraped. None of it touched the space they were sitting in. James came through the doorway behind me, Cole said. He wasn't supposed to. His position was to hold the entrance. That was the protocol, that was the assignment. But he didn't hold. He came through, and he came through fast and low, and he took the angle I didn't have, and the man on my left went down before he could finish what he'd started. Cole looked at the table. James took a round in the left shoulder doing so. It went through clean, nothing permanent, but he went down, and he stayed down for about 40 seconds, and I thought, he stopped. I thought he was gone. Alora's hand was pressed flat against her sternum. She could feel the dog tags underneath. He wasn't gone, Cole said. He was fine, relatively. He sat up after 40 seconds, looked at me and said, Cole made a sound that was almost a laugh, but not quite something rougher and more complicated than a laugh. He said, are you going to help me up, or are you just going to stand there looking sorry? Cole shook his head. 22 years old, bleeding through his shirt, looking at me like I was the one who needed checking on. Alora made a sound she hadn't planned to make. Not a cry, something shorter, sharper. She pressed her lips together. We got him treated, Cole said. He was back on duty in 11 days. He never mentioned it again. Not to me, not to anyone in that unit that I heard of. He didn't trade on it. He didn't hold it over me. He looked up at her. I have thought about that afternoon more times than I can count. In 23 years, I have thought about it more times than any other single moment in my life. And I never knew his last name. I knew James. I knew his face. I knew his voice. But his paperwork went back with his unit when the rotation ended, and I never he stopped. I looked, twice. Couldn't get the right thread. He never told me that story, Alora said. Her voice was steady. She was making it steady through conscious effort, the kind of effort that costs something. He wouldn't have, Cole said. That's the kind of man he was. She looked at Cole Kincaid, at the gray in his hair, the lines in his face, the marine pin on his collar, and she understood something she hadn't understood before, something that reordered the morning completely. The 6 bikers who hadn't looked like they were paying attention until the moment it was critical. The way Cole had stood up without a word passing between them. The way he'd been watching Victor Castellano from the moment the man walked in, with the particular fixed quality of someone who had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the confirmation. He hadn't come into this diner by accident, and he hadn't stood up for a stranger. He'd stood up for James. He would have done the same thing for you, she said. I know, Cole said. That's the problem. She understood that too. The weight of a debt that a man can't repay to the person who's owed it. The way that weight transfers, the way it has to go somewhere, the way it had apparently been looking for a place to land for 23 years. Before either of them could say anything else, Ox appeared at the table with his phone again. His expression had changed, not dramatically, but in the way a face changes when information has arrived that upgrades a situation from serious to urgent. We've got a problem, Ox said. Cole looked at him. Castellano made 2 calls in the last hour, Ox said. I've got a contact monitoring his local associates. Don't ask how, it's clean, and the first call was to his lawyer. The second one was to Gerald Potts. He set the phone down. Potts sent a notice to 4 of his tenants 30 minutes ago. Electronic delivery. Alora's is one of them. Alora felt the floor shift under her. What kind of notice? 30-day notice of lease non-renewal, Ox said. Standard form, but the timing is him, Cole said flatly. Yes. Alora picked up her phone from where it had been sitting on the table since before Deputy Tate arrived. She opened her email with hands that were steady because she made them be steady. It was there. Delivered 47 minutes ago. Gerald Potts Property Management 30-day notice of non-renewal, the language clinical and impersonal and absolutely devastating in its timing. 4 days after she'd been 3 days late on rent for the first time in 2 years, a late payment, she'd explained, and that Potts had said in writing was noted and forgiven, but apparently not forgotten, apparently held in reserve. He did this in the last hour, she said, while I was sitting here giving my statement to a deputy. Yes, Cole said. He can't actually enforce this while I'm protected under... She stopped, frowned. What are my protections here? I don't know. Tennessee landlord-tenant law, well enough to know what... You have protections, Cole said, and the certainty in his voice was the kind that comes from having already looked at this, from having already thought it through. Retaliatory eviction is illegal in Tennessee if you can establish the connection between a protected action and the notice. Giving a police statement this morning qualifies. He looked at Ox. We need Hendricks on the phone. Already texting him, Ox said. Who's Hendricks? Alora said. Lawyer, Cole said. He does pro bono work for veterans and their families. He's in Knoxville, but he handles cases across the state. I've already texted him your situation, the basics, and he's going to want to talk to you today. The pace of the morning, which had already been faster than anything she'd managed in months, accelerated again. She felt it the way events were compounding, each one landing before she'd finished absorbing the one before it, the way a river gets when a secondary current joins it, and suddenly the whole thing is moving at a different speed. Cole. That was one of the other bikers, the one near the door, a lean man in his 40s named Danny who had said almost nothing all morning, but who now had his phone to his ear and his eyes on the window. Castellano's car is parked on the street. He hasn't left. The diner went taut. Cole turned toward the window without hurrying. He looked out, looked back. Is he in it? Cole said. Passenger seat. one of his associates behind the wheel, just sitting. Cole absorbed this for exactly 2 seconds. All right, he said. Donna. Donna materialized. She had Alora was beginning to understand an uncanny ability to materialize at the exact moment she was needed, which was probably a function of having managed this space for so long that she'd developed a sixth sense for its temperature. He's outside, Cole said. Don't go to the window. Don't let any of your staff go to the window. Go about your morning normally. Is he going to come back in? Donna said. I don't think so, Cole said. I think he's watching. He wants to know what's happening in here, who's talking to who, what the response looks like. He paused, which means we don't give him anything useful to look at. Donna nodded and went back to running her diner. Cole looked at Alora. You have about 6 hours of shift left. 4, she said. I'm on until 2. Can you work your shift? She looked at him for a moment, thought about the 30-day notice, the 7 months of pregnancy, the ache in her cheek that was settling into something more specific and persistent, thought about what it meant, what it would signal to a man sitting in a car outside watching if she gathered her things and left. Yes, she said, I can work my shift. Something moved in Cole's face that was not quite pride, but was adjacent to it. Good, he said. Then do that. We'll be here. She stood up. She straightened her apron. She picked up her order pad. She went back to work. The next 3 hours were the most surreal of her life, and that was a high bar to clear given the year she'd had. She moved through the diner's late morning rhythm, the post-rush lull, the early lunch crowd beginning to build, and she took orders and delivered food and refilled coffee and smiled at people. And in the corner booth, the 6 Hells Angels sat and did what appeared to everyone else in the room to be nothing in particular. They ate. They talked among themselves. They had more coffee. Danny went outside twice, not in the direction of Castellano's car, in the opposite direction, always back within 4 minutes. Millie came down from upstairs at 10:45. She did not look surprised to find 6 bikers still occupying the corner booth, which confirmed what Alora had suspected, that Millie had more context for all of this than she'd let on. She went to her usual counter stool. She ordered her coffee. She sat with her paper. And at 11, she got up and walked to the corner booth without being summoned, and she sat down across from Cole, and they talked for about 12 minutes in voices too low for Alora to hear. Whatever passed between them, Millie came back to her stool afterward with the particular expression of a woman who had confirmed something she'd believed but needed to hear out loud. At 11:15, Castellano's car was still parked outside. Danny, on his 3rd rotation, reported this with the brevity of a man who had done surveillance before and knew how to read patients as a tactic. At 11:23, something new happened. Alora was at the counter waiting on an order when the door opened and 2 men came in who were not Castellano and were not customers. She knew they weren't customers the way you know certain things without knowing how you know something in their posture, the way they scanned the room before finding a table, the deliberate quality of how they moved. They were young mid-30s, both in business casual that was slightly too careful to be incidental. They took a table in the middle of the diner. Cole had clocked them before they sat down. He looked at Alora, briefly, barely. It was more a question than a look. She gave the smallest possible shake of her head. She didn't know them. He looked at Ox. Something communicated between them that required no words. Ox got up, unhurried, entirely normal in affect, and walked to the restrooms, which happened to take him past the table where the 2 men had sat. He came back 2 minutes later, leaned toward Cole, and said something very quietly. Cole pulled out his phone, typed something, waited. 30 seconds later, read something. He looked at Alora. She came to the table on the pretext of offering more coffee. One of the cups on the far side needed topping, which gave her a reason to be close. The 2 men who just came in, Cole said without looking at her, his voice barely above the ambient noise. They're not law enforcement. They're private investigators. Likely Castellanos. She poured the coffee without her hand shaking. She was unreasonably proud of this. What are they here to do? She murmured. Document. Take note of who you're talking to. Build a narrative that he can use to complicate your statement. She was in contact with individuals connected to organized crime before making allegations. That kind of thing. Cole's voice was calm and slightly bored, as if he were discussing a menu item. Don't change anything you're doing. Work your tables. When you come to theirs, be exactly who you are. She went to their table. She smiled. She took their order, both ordered coffee, nothing else, which told her everything about their actual purpose in the diner. She brought the coffee. She said thank you and moved on. She was good at being exactly who she was. She'd had 11 months of practice at surviving in plain sight. At 11:40, a car pulled up outside that was not Castellano's. It was a county sheriff's vehicle. Two deputies got out. Deputy Tate was one of them. Through the window, she could see Tate walk directly to Castellano's parked car. She couldn't hear the conversation. She could see Castellano's window going down the brief exchange, the particular body language of a man who is accustomed to being treated with deference, finding himself in a conversation that is not deferential. The window went back up. The car, after a long pause, pulled away. The diner exhaled. He called it in, Ox said at Cole's elbow. Tate, he had the car running the plates before he even came in this morning. Good man, Cole said. The two private investigators finished their coffees, left 15%, and departed 7 minutes after Castellano's car. By the time the lunch crowd began filling in, the diner had an almost ordinary quality about it. If you didn't know what had happened in it 3 hours earlier, if you didn't notice the 6 bikers in the corner who'd been there since 6 in the morning, if you didn't look at the mark on the server's cheek that makeup hadn't fully covered because she'd been at work before she'd had time to try. Alora noticed that people regulars, people who knew her, people who'd seen what happened were tipping more, not performatively, quietly, leaving the bills on the table and walking out before she could say anything about it. The retired teachers came back in, which they never did for lunch, and ordered pie, which they never ordered, and left a $20 tip on an $8 order. And the older one, Mrs. Patricia Harlow, who taught high school English for 32 years in this county, put her hand briefly on Alora's arm on the way out and said, "You did good today, honey," and walked out before Alora could respond. She stood there for a moment with the weight of Mrs. Harlow's hand still on her arm. She was not going to cry on shift. She had established this as a firm policy and she intended to maintain it. She went back to work. At 12:30, Cole called her to the table. "Hendricks is available at 3, he said. "That gives you time after your shift. He wants to do a call, you, me, and him about the eviction notice. He's already pulled the property records and he thinks we have a very clean retaliatory eviction case, especially with the timeline and the existence of Tate's report." "Okay," she said. "There's more," Cole said. She waited. The tax default Castellano described this morning, Hendricks looked at the actual filing. What Castellano told you was real but incomplete. The default is genuine, but there's a redemption period that Potts hasn't yet exhausted, and the notice Potts sent you today may actually have voided his ability to use that default as justification for lease changes, because the notice itself constitutes an action against the tenancy that complicates the property's legal status. He looked at her. "What I'm telling you is that Castellano overplayed his hand this morning. He threatened you with information that he expected you wouldn't know how to parse. And in doing so, he created a chain of documentation that ties the threat to the notice, to the assault, to his ownership interest in the property, all in one morning." She processed this. "He made it worse for himself." "Significantly," Cole said. "Men like him are used to people backing down. When you told him you weren't calling him, he escalated beyond what his situation could actually support." "Because he thought I had no one," she said. "Yes," Cole said. She sat with that for a moment. The particular cruelty of it, not just the calculated pressure, but the assumption underneath it. That a pregnant widow working doubles in a small-town diner was a person who could be managed because she was alone. That her exhaustion was the same as helplessness. That her politeness was the same as compliance. "I want him held accountable," she said. "Not with heat. Flatly, clearly, the way you state a thing, you mean precisely." "So do we," Cole said. "Not just for this morning," she said. "For all of it. The property manipulation, the financial engineering, the way he's been doing this to people in this county who don't have anyone sitting in the corner booth watching." She paused. "There are other people, Cole, other tenants, other businesses, other Millies who didn't have 6 people walk through the door this morning." Cole was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with the same careful quality of attention he'd had since the beginning, the quality that was not pity, not sympathy exactly, but something more like recognition. "Yes," he said, "there are." "Then that's what this needs to be about," she said. "Not just me." Ox made a sound from where he was standing nearby. Not a word, just a sound, The kind a man makes when he hears something said that confirms a judgment he'd already formed. Cole looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said, "then that's what it's going to be." What happened in the next 90 minutes happened quickly and in several directions at once. Cole was on his phone more than he was off it. Ox was doing something on a laptop that had appeared from somewhere, a saddlebag she assumed that involved property records, filing dates, and a spreadsheet that was growing in ways she couldn't fully follow from her position as a working server. Danny and two of the others made 2 trips outside and came back each time with new information she received in fragments. Castellano had gone to his office in the next town over, a building he leased on the 2nd floor above a dry goods store. The same LLC that owned Gerald Potts' rental management operation had a registered interest in 3 other properties in 2 adjacent counties. The law firm that served as registered agent for Castellano's various entities had a senior partner who had twice been sanctioned by the Tennessee State Bar, once for a conflict of interest and once for something described in the public record, in language so carefully neutral that you had to read it 3 times to understand it described fraud. By 1:15 in the afternoon, Alora's shift was winding down, and the picture that had been assembled in the corner of Millie's Corner Diner was not of a local businessman with aggressive acquisition habits. It was of a multi-county operation that had been running for at least 6 years, that had forced at least 14 property sales that could be connected to financial pressure of the kind Castellano had described to her this morning, and that had been doing all of this behind a wall of LLCs and a law firm whose job was to make sure the wall never looked like what it was. Deputy Tate came back at 1:30. He sat down across from Cole, and the conversation they had lasted 22 minutes, and at the end of it, Tate's face had the specific expression of a man who has been given a map to a territory he had suspected existed but had never been able to navigate. "How long have you had this?" Tate said, looking at what Ox had put together. "Parts of it 8 months," Cole said. "The most recent pieces this morning. You understand I have to verify all of this independently before any of it can be used." "I'd expect nothing less," Cole said. Tate looked at the screen for another moment. "If this is what it looks like." "It's what it looks like," Cole said. "Then this isn't a local matter," Tate said. "This is going to have to go up." "Yes," Cole said, "it is." Tate looked at Alora, who was sitting at the end of the table where she'd come to sit when her shift had ended 10 minutes ago, her apron off her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that Donna had put in front of her without being asked. "Miss Whitmore," Tate said, "I want to be direct with you. What happened to you this morning was the most visible piece of something larger. Your statement combined with this documentation gives us a foundation to open a formal investigation that goes well beyond the assault. That investigation is going to take time. It's going to be complicated. It's possible that Castellano has enough resources to slow it down, at least initially." "I know," she said. "What you need to understand is that in the meantime you are a witness in an active matter," he said, "which means you have protections you may not have had this morning when you came to work. And it means I'm a target," she said. Tate didn't flinch from that. "Potentially, yes." She nodded. She'd known it before he said it. She'd known it since the moment Cole had said the car was still parked outside, since the moment the 2 private investigators had come in and ordered coffee they didn't drink. "What do you recommend?" "I recommend you not be alone," he said. "Not for the next several days, minimum." She almost laughed, not with humor, with the specific, exhausted irony of a woman who had been alone for 11 months and who was now in the space of a single morning apparently not going to be. "I'll manage that," she said. After Tate left, the diner was quieter. The lunch crowd had thinned. Millie was back on her stool. The corner booth had Cole and Ox and one other, the rest having cycled in and out through the afternoon. Randy was cleaning the kitchen. Donna was counting the register. Alora sat at the corner table and looked at the surface in front of her and thought about the 30-day notice sitting in her email. Thought about the apartment on Clover Street. Where the baby's room was half finished, she'd been painting it in sections on days off using the colors she and James had picked out together from a catalog before he deployed a warm yellow that they'd both agreed was the right color for a child who deserved to grow up surrounded by warmth. The crib was assembled. The small dresser was in the corner. The mobile she'd hung from the ceiling on a Saturday afternoon while listening to the radio was still spinning slightly when the heating vent blew. She was not losing that apartment. She was not letting this child come into the world without a room, without the yellow walls and the mobile and the dresser in the corner. She felt it then, not the fear, not the exhaustion, not even the grief, but something that had been underneath of them for 11 months. something she'd been keeping below the surface because she hadn't had the resources to act on it. Anger, clean, specific, fully formed anger at what had been done to her and what had been done to all the other people in this county, whose names she didn't know, but whose situations she could now imagine with perfect clarity because she'd been standing inside one all morning. She picked up her phone and called her mother. Her mother lived in Knoxville and had been calling her every 3 days since James died and had offered 70 times in 11 months to come help and had been told 70 times that Alora was fine. She answered on the second ring. "Alora, Mom," she said, "I need you to come." A pause. 3 years of Alora saying "I'm fine" had taught her mother how significant those 4 words were. "I'm in the car in 40 minutes, her mother said. "Okay," Alora said. "Thank you." She hung up, set the phone down, looked up. Cole was watching her from across the diner, not intrusively, just with that same quality of steady attention. She met his eyes. Something passed between them that didn't require words, an acknowledgement, a recognition of where they were and how they'd gotten here, and what the ground felt like under all of it. She thought about James, about what James would have made of this day, of these men, of the particular shape the universe had taken when she wasn't looking. James, who had believed with the practical certainty of a man who'd seen the worst of what people could do, and the best of it in the same hour that the world had more people worth trusting in it than the alternative. James, who had walked through a doorway he wasn't supposed to walk through because a man he'd known for 6 weeks needed someone to walk through it. She thought about the child moving inside her, the rolling pressure, the reminder. She pressed her hand to her stomach. The baby shifted. "I know," she said quietly. "I know who we come from." She was so focused on that internal moment that she almost missed the sound from outside. Almost. But Kellner Creek was a small town with a particular acoustic quality in the afternoon, and the sound of tires on gravel from a vehicle moving fast down the side street was recognizable enough that she registered it half a second before Danny, who was near the window, said sharply, "Cole." Cole was already standing. The vehicle that stopped outside was not Castellano's car. It was a dark pickup, a big one, and it sat at the curb for 4 seconds, long enough for everyone in the diner who was paying attention to understand that it was deliberate before a single item was thrown from the passenger window onto the sidewalk outside Millie's front door, and then the truck gunned its engine and was gone. Danny was outside in 8 seconds. He came back in with a manila envelope. He set it on the table in front of Cole without touching the outside of it more than necessary. Cole looked at it. The front of the envelope had one word on it, handwritten in marker, "Alora." The diner was completely silent. Alora stood up and walked to the table and looked at the envelope with her name on it and understood that she had in fact miscalculated one thing this morning. She'd understood that Castellano would retaliate. She hadn't quite understood the speed. She hadn't understood that a man who had been publicly embarrassed, whose leverage had been named out loud and documented, whose car had been moved along by a deputy, would spend his afternoon not retreating, but accelerating. "Don't touch it," Cole said. "I know," she said. He called Tate. Tate arrived in 11 minutes. The envelope was photographed in place before anyone opened it. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a legal notice from Castellano's law firm, formally addressed to Millie Haddam, citing a noise ordinance complaint, a health code inquiry, and 2 zoning questions about the diner's signage and its rear storage area, all filed that afternoon with the county. Each item was individually small. Together, they were what Cole recognized immediately and named without hesitation. "He's opening a campaign," Cole said. "He can't come after her directly anymore. Not today, not with a deputy's report on file, so he's going to use the regulatory system. File complaints require responses, generate legal costs. It's slow and it's expensive, and it's designed to wear people down." "Can he do that?" Donna asked. "He can file," Cole said. "Whether the complaints have merit is a different question, and the answer to that question is almost certainly no. But responding to them isn't free." The second document was not a legal notice. It was a single sheet of paper, no letterhead, no signature. 5 sentences. Alora read it twice. Then she set it down on the table and took 2 steps back. Cole read it. His face didn't change, not exactly, but something behind it went very still and very cold in the way a deep river goes cold, the temperature not on the surface but underneath where the current runs. The letter described in specific and deliberate detail the route that Alora drove home from work, the time she typically left, the parking situation at her building, the fact that she walked from the street to the entrance alone. And the observation that a woman in her condition alone at night in a parking area was in a situation that could easily become considerably more complicated. Nobody spoke. Then Ox said in a voice that was very quiet and completely flat, "That's a threat." "That's a threat," Cole confirmed. Tate was already on his radio. Alora stood in the middle of Millie's Corner Diner and felt the full weight of the day settle onto her. At once, the morning, the slap, the statement, the eviction notice, the private investigators, the envelope on the sidewalk, the letter that described her walk from her car to her door at night, the child who wasn't born yet and who deserved a world where this kind of letter didn't exist. And she felt it all, and she did not collapse under it. She didn't collapse because she was the woman who had gotten up every morning for 11 months and made the bed and put on the uniform and smiled at every customer and kept the tags around her neck and kept the yellow walls in process and kept the mobile spinning and kept herself moving forward through all of it. And she had not come this far by going down under the weight of things. But she was not doing this alone anymore. She turned to Cole. "What do we do?" she said. And Cole Kincaid, who had been looking for 23 years for the place to put down a debt that had no other address, looked back at her with the settled certainty of a man who had finally found it. "We don't let him isolate you," he said. "Starting tonight, you're not going back to that apartment alone." "My mother's coming," she said. "Good. She can stay where you're going to stay." He glanced at Ox. "Hendricks has a contact," Ox said. "Safe house situation. It's a network the VA uses sometimes for families in transition. Legitimate, documented, nothing he can touch." "You set this up already," Alora said. It wasn't a question. "We started making calls when the car was still outside," Cole said. "We weren't going to wait to see what came next." She looked at him, at the weight of 23 years in his face, at the pin on his collar, at the 6 men who had walked into a diner that morning and decided without being asked to see something that needed seeing. "Cole," she said. "Yeah." "He saved your life," she said. "James saved your life, and you never got to tell him." Cole held her gaze. "No," he said. "I didn't." "Then tell me," she said. "Tell me everything. Tell me all of it. What he was like, what he said, how he moved, what he did the 6 weeks you knew him. Tell me the things I don't know yet." Her voice held steady. "Because that child is going to need to know who their father was. And you're the only person I've found who knew him in a way I didn't." Something in Cole Kincaid's face changed completely. Not broke, changed. Like a thing that had been held under pressure for a very long time was finally being permitted to surface. "I'll tell you everything I remember," he said. "Every word." Outside, Deputy Tate was on his radio calling in the threat. Somewhere across town, Victor Castellano was in an office making calculations that were about to stop adding up the way he expected. The afternoon light was shifting toward evening. Alora's mother was on the highway doing 75 in a 55 because her daughter had called and said come, and she had come. And in the corner of Millie's Diner, a woman who had been carrying a soldier's legacy alone for 11 months finally had somewhere to put some of the weight. Tate's radio call went up the chain faster than anyone in that diner had anticipated. And the reason it went fast was the specific language of the letter. The route, the timing, the parking area, the reference to a woman in her condition, which crossed a legal threshold that transformed the morning's assault charge into something with considerably more investigative gravity. By 4:15, a second sheriff's vehicle was outside. By 4:40, Tate was on a call with the county DA's office that lasted 19 minutes and ended with him standing straighter than he had when it started. Alora sat through all of it at the corner table. Her mother, Sandra Briggs, had arrived at 4:22. She'd done the drive in under an hour, which meant she'd driven the way mothers drive when they are frightened for their children and have decided that speed limits are a negotiable consideration. She was 61 with Alora's same dark hair gone mostly silver, and she walked into Millie's Corner Diner, clocked the sheriff's deputies and the bikers and her daughter's face in about 4 seconds, and sat down next to Alora and took both of her hands without saying a single word. That was the moment Alora came the closest to crying. She managed not to. She'd given herself a rule about the shift, and even though the shift was technically over, she was still in the building. "Tell me," Sandra said. Alora told her. Not everything the full version would take hours, and this wasn't the hour for it, but enough, the shape of the morning. Victor Castellano and what he'd done, Cole and what he'd said, The eviction notice, the envelope, the letter that described her walk from her car to her door. Sandra listened without interrupting. Her face went through several things while she listened, and Alora watched them pass: fear, then fury, then the particular controlled stillness. That was how Sandra Briggs had moved through every hard thing Alora had ever watched her move through. She'd buried a husband early, raised a daughter mostly alone, worked 30 years in hospital administration, and had the kind of practical toughness that comes not from never being afraid, but from being afraid and doing the next thing anyway. "Okay," Sandra said when Alora finished. "What do we need to do?" It was the right question. Alora had known she was going to ask it, and the relief of it, the simple, efficient practicality of her mother's love, moved through her like something physical. "I need to not go back to the apartment tonight," Alora said. "Cole has arranged somewhere." Sandra looked at Cole across the diner. Cole, who had been watching the exchange with appropriate distance, met her eyes. Sandra studied him for a moment with the unvarnished assessment of a woman who had no time for performances. "You the one who stood up for my daughter this morning," Sandra said across the room. "Yes, ma'am," Cole said. "And you knew her husband," Sandra said. It was not a question. Alora had included that in the summary. "I did," Cole said. Sandra held his gaze for another 3 seconds. Then she nodded once with the finality of someone who has run a calculation and accepted the result. She turned back to Alora. "All right, where are we going?" Before Cole could answer, Ox appeared at the table with his laptop and turned the screen toward Alora and Sandra. "Hendrik has confirmed the location," and he said, "It's a private residence, belongs to a veteran's family, part of a network the VA uses informally for temporary housing situations. It's 30 minutes from here, in a name that has no connection to Alora's, and it has room for 2. Sandra looked at the screen. "How long?" "Until the legal situation is clarified enough that her current housing is either secured or replaced," Ox said. "Hendricks' estimate is 7 to 14 days for the eviction notice to be formally challenged and an injunction obtained. The assault charge changes the calculus on Castellano's ability to pursue anything aggressively in the interim." "What about her things?" Sandra said. "The baby's room, the furniture." "We'll arrange a time to collect what she needs," Cole said from where he was. "Not tonight. Tonight the priority is that she's somewhere he can't find and can't approach." Sandra absorbed this with the speed of someone who has spent 3 decades processing urgent information and making fast decisions on incomplete data. "Alora," she said, "is this what you want?" Alora thought about the yellow walls, the mobile, the crib, the dresser in the corner that James had picked out from a catalog on a video call, pointing at the screen with a grin and saying that that's the one, it's solid wood, it'll last longer than both of us. She thought about the apartment on Clover Street that she'd made into the closest thing to a home she'd been able to manage in 11 months of managing alone. She thought about the letter describing her walk from her car to her door. "Yes," she said, "this is what I want." At 4:50, Tate came back to the corner table. He sat down with the manner of a man who has received news and is organizing how to deliver it. "The DA's office is opening a formal investigation," he said. "The letter constitutes criminal threatening in Tennessee. It's specific, it's directed, and it's timed immediately after a documented assault on the same victim. That's not coincidental, and the DA's office is treating it as coordinated." Cole leaned forward slightly. "Are they looking at Castellano directly or through the business entities?" "Both," Tate said. "And here's what I wasn't expecting when they ran his name through the system at the state level. There are 2 prior investigations. One in Bradley County 4 years ago that was closed without charges, but the documentation from that investigation is still on file, and it's consistent with what Ox put together this morning. Same pattern: financial pressure on residential properties, regulatory harassment of businesses that didn't cooperate, witnesses who declined to testify." "Why didn't they charge him 4 years ago?" Alora said. Tate's expression was careful. "The primary witness withdrew. Officially, the reason given was personal. The investigator who handled it retired 8 months later." The table understood what that meant without it being spelled out. "The second investigation," Cole said. "Marion County 2 years ago, also closed. The property at the center of it sold to a Castellano-adjacent LLC 3 weeks after the investigation was discontinued." Tate paused. "The DA's office is now treating today's events as potentially the 3rd instance of a pattern. That changes what they're willing to do." Alora felt something shift in her chest, not relief exactly, not yet, but the precursor to it. The sense of a weight being redistributed moved from the place it had been pressing to somewhere larger, somewhere with more people and more structure to bear it. "What does that mean for me practically?" she said. "It means you're a protected witness in a felony investigation," Tate said. "It means the eviction notice Potts sent this afternoon is going to be flagged as potentially part of a coordinated intimidation campaign, which makes it considerably harder to enforce while the investigation is active. And it means that if Castellano or anyone associated with him makes any further contact with you," he paused, "it's not going to go well for them." Sandra Briggs made a sound beside Alora that was approximately 70% satisfaction and 30% something that would have been profane if she'd let it out fully. At 5:15, Cole's phone rang. He looked at the screen, stood immediately, and stepped away from the table. His voice was too low to hear clearly, but the quality of his body language changed, a sharpening, an alertness that was different from the controlled steadiness he'd been carrying all day. It lasted 4 minutes. When he came back, his face was doing the thing Alora had learned to read the surface calm over something moving underneath. "What?" she said. He sat down, looked at Tate first, then at Alora. "I have a contact in the county assessor's office. Not law enforcement, someone we know through other work. She's been pulling property records since I texted her this morning." He paused. "Castellano's holdings in this county are larger than what Ox found in the public filings. There's a second layer, 3 additional properties held through a real estate investment trust that's registered in Delaware, which is why it didn't show up in the Tennessee search. One of those properties is the building next to Millie's." Silence. "The building next to Millie's," Tate said slowly. "The one with the HVAC unit on the shared wall," Cole said. "The one that, if it were purchased and developed in a particular way, would significantly impact the diner's ability to operate noise access ventilation." "He was going to box her in," Millie said. Everyone turned. Millie Haddam had gotten up from her counter stool at some point in the last few minutes and was now standing at the edge of the table, small and white-haired and absolutely composed, with her coffee cup in her hand and her creek-water eyes moving from Cole to Tate to the middle distance. "He was going to make staying here untenable," Millie said. "Not by buying this building, by making everything around it something I couldn't operate next to." She looked at Cole. "I've owned this building for 53 years. I know exactly what it would take to make it unworkable." She paused. "He was very thorough." "Was," Cole said. "Past tense is right." "Is he finished?" Millie asked, direct without ceremony. "He's not finished yet," Cole said. "But the shape of what he was building is now visible. And visible things are considerably harder to operate than invisible ones." He looked at Tate. "The Delaware Trust is going to need to be part of the DA's investigation." "I'll make that call tonight," Tate said. Millie nodded. She looked at Alora. She reached out and touched her cheek, the side where the mark still was, gently, with the brief and complete tenderness of a woman who has been storing that gesture for hours. Then she went back to her stool. By 6 in the evening, the plan for the night was set. Alora and Sandra would go to the safe house, Cole and Danny would follow, and confirm the location was clean before they left. Ox would remain in Kellner Creek to coordinate with Tate if anything developed overnight. Hendricks would file the challenge to the eviction notice first thing in the morning and had already sent a letter to Gerald Potts's personal email, not the property management address, his personal email, which Hendricks had obtained through means that were legal, but that Potts would find disconcerting, notifying him that the notice was being treated as retaliatory and that any further action on it would be met with a civil suit naming him personally, not his LLC. Hendricks's call with Alora had lasted 27 minutes and had covered more ground in more practical detail than any legal conversation she'd had since James died. He was 60 sharp, with a manner that was simultaneously brusque and kind, the manner of someone who has been fighting on behalf of people who needed it for long enough that he'd lost patience for anything decorative, but had never lost the reason he was doing it. "You understand that this is going to require you to be available and consistent," he'd said. "The investigation is going to ask things of you over the coming weeks. Documents, statements, follow-up calls. It's not going to be easy." "Mr. Hendricks," she'd said, "I've been working double shifts, 7 months pregnant, to pay rent on an apartment I'm now being forced out of, while managing prenatal care on a delayed VA benefit in processing the death of my husband without any structural support. I know how to do hard things." A pause on the other end of the line. Then, yes, I can hear that. We'll get on well, Ms. Whitmore. After the call, she'd sat for a moment with the phone in her lap and thought about how different the afternoon felt from the morning. Not easier, exactly nothing about her situation had been resolved. The eviction notice still existed. The threat letter existed. Castellano still had money and lawyers and a pattern of behavior that had successfully avoided consequences twice before. None of the walls he'd built had come down yet. They had only been named, documented, brought into the light where other people could see them. But named things were different from unnamed things. Documented things were different from invisible ones. And she was not alone in a way she had not been for 11 months. At 6:30, while Sandra was in the restroom and Tate had stepped outside to make calls and Donna was closing the diner down for the evening with the methodical efficiency of someone who had survived a significant day and intended to survive the next one, Cole sat down across from Alora one more time. "Before you go," he said, "I want to finish what you asked me." She looked at him. "You asked me to tell you about James," he said. "Everything I remember." "You don't have to do it tonight," she said. "You've already done Poecoa tonight," he said. "While it's still today, I've been waiting 23 years to say some of this to the right person, and I'd like to say it." She folded her hands on the table. "Okay," she said. He talked for 22 minutes. He told her things she hadn't known James at 22 in Fallujah, the specific way he'd moved through uncertain spaces. Careful and fast, with the kind of awareness that some people are born with and some develop under pressure. He told her about the 6 weeks, the bad jokes James had told that were genuinely terrible and somehow still made the whole unit laugh, the way he'd carried a worn paperback in his chest pocket that he read in every available moment, the way he talked about home with the specific precision of a man who knew exactly what he had waiting for him and intended to get back to it. He told her about the day in the building exactly as he'd described it before, but with more the detail of the 40 seconds he'd thought James was gone, the way time had moved during it, the specific relief of James sitting up and speaking the particular words the way James had looked at him. He told her about the shoulder wound which James had described to the medic as a minor inconvenience, and had told his unit commander he barely noticed which was a lie that everyone knew was a lie, and that James maintained with complete conviction. He told her that in his estimation, James Whitmore had been the kind of man that units were built around, without anyone planning it, the kind whose presence raised the quality of everything happening near him, not through leadership or authority, but through a baseline expectation of decency that everyone around him unconsciously rose to meet. Alora listened to every word. She stored every word. She put them in the same place. She kept the dog tags somewhere internal and solid and real. When he finished, she said, "Thank you." "Thank you," he said, "for letting me say it." She picked up the tags through her shirt, held them for a moment. "He would have liked you," she said. "He was specific about who he respected. It took him time, but once he decided that was it." She paused. "He would have decided about you in about 6 weeks, I'd say." Cole made the sound that was not quite a laugh, but was the real version of one rough, genuine, coming from somewhere that didn't get much use. "That tracks," he said. Sandra came back from the restroom, assessed the quality of the moment with the accuracy of a woman who had been reading rooms for 61 years, and sat down quietly without interrupting whatever was still in the air. The next morning arrived with the particular quality of mornings after difficult days, slightly too bright, sounds slightly too sharp, the body registering before the mind catches up that something significant has changed. Alora woke in the safe house, a clean, warm bedroom in the home of a veteran named Earl and his wife Ruth, who had made them dinner the night before and asked no questions beyond what they needed, and lay still for a moment before she remembered everything. Then she got up. She made the bed, old habit. Her phone had 12 messages, 3 from numbers she didn't recognize. She flagged them for Hendricks, 2 from Donna updating her on the diner status, 1 from Tate, 4 from Cole, 1 from Millie, which was only 4 words and was exactly what she would have expected from Millie. "You did good. Come back." She read Cole's messages in order. The first sent at 11:40 the previous night. "Ox confirmed no activity at your building or the diner overnight. Castellano's office has been dark since 7. The second at 12:15, Hendricks filed the formal response to the eviction notice. He also sent Potts' attorney a litigation hold notice for all communications between Potts and Castellano in the last 18 months. Potts called his attorney 4 times in the 2 hours after receiving it. The third at 6:40 this morning, DIA's office confirmed they're treating this as organized. They're working with the Tennessee AG's office on the Delaware Trust angle. This is bigger than this county now. The fourth sent 8 minutes ago. There's something you need to know. Call me when you're up. She called him. He answered on the first ring. Morning, huh, he said. What is it, she said. Potts called Hendricks directly this morning, Cole said. Not through his attorney himself at 7 a.m. on Hendricks's direct line. He wants to cooperate. Alora sat down on the edge of the bed. Cooperate how? He's willing to testify, Cole said, about Castellano's involvement in the property management operation, the structure of the financial arrangements, the instructions he received about specific tenants, including you. Why? Because his attorney apparently spent last night explaining to him what a litigation hold notice means for his personal financial exposure and what being the LLC manager of a property operation that forms part of a criminal conspiracy means when the conspiracy is being investigated by the state AI's office. Cole paused. Gerald Potts is many things, but apparently a man willing to take a federal adjacent charge to protect Victor Castellano is not one of them. She processed this. He's going to give them the inside of the operation. If what he told Hendricks this morning is accurate, yes. He has communications, financial records, instructions from Castellano's representatives going back 4 years. He has documentation of the tax default being engineered deliberately, of which tenants were targeted, and why of what the end goal for each property was. Cole paused again. He has your file, Alora, the one Castellano's office kept on you. When you started working at Millie's, your financial situation, your husband's death, your pregnancy, your lease terms, it goes back 8 months. The cold that moved through her at that was specific and nauseating. The understanding that she had been watched, cataloged, assessed as a resource for this man's operation for 8 months, while she'd been moving through her ordinary days, thinking of herself as invisible. The prenatal appointments she'd attended alone. The double shifts, the late rent payment that had been noted and held. All of it filed and organized by someone who saw her as a lever. He had a file on me before he walked into the diner, she said. Yes, Cole said. Yesterday wasn't opportunistic. You were selected. She stood up. She walked to the window and put her hand flat against the glass for a moment, the cool of it, the solidity, and breathed. Okay, she said. You all right? No, she said, but I will be. What does Potts's cooperation mean for the timeline? It accelerates everything, Cole said. Substantially. Hendricks thinks the AG's office could move on the criminal complaint within 72 hours if Potts's documents are what he says they are. The eviction notice is already legally dead. Hendricks got a call from the county court clerk this morning confirming a judge has agreed to hear the injunction request on an expedited basis given the criminal investigation. She let out a breath. 72 hours. The number had a shape to it, specific, measurable, survivable. There's more, Cole said, and this part I want to say carefully. Say it. The other tenants Potts has records on, there are 11 of them in this county alone. Families who were pushed out of properties over the last 4 years, people who accepted cash settlements to leave without understanding that the settlements were below market and structured to prevent future claims. Potts has the records of all of it. He paused. Hendricks is going to reach out to some of those families. With their permission with yours, as the primary complainant, the investigation becomes a class-level action. Not just what happened to you yesterday. The whole pattern going back 4 years with names and documentation. She thought about what she'd said to Cole the previous afternoon. There are other people, other Millies, 11 families, 11 situations like hers, except they hadn't had 6 bikers walk in at the right moment. Do it, she said. Whatever Hendricks needs from me to make that happen, do it. I expected you'd say that, Cole said. Cole, yeah. The people Castellano pushed out of their homes, she said. Some of them, where did they go? A pause. We don't know yet. Potts may have that information, Hendricks will ask. Because if some of them ended up in worse situations, she stopped. The sentence had more weight than she could carry in one breath. If there are people who need help the way I needed help yesterday, I want to know about it. I want to do something about it. When this is over, when I'm on the other side of it. Cole was quiet for a moment. All right, he said, we'll find them. She trusted that he meant it. She trusted it the way she'd trusted very few things in the past 11 months, with the specific certainty that comes not from being told something reassuring, but from watching someone demonstrate in the actual world that their word corresponded to their actions. She went to find Sandra and tell her the morning's news. The day that followed was not dramatic in the way that the previous day had been dramatic. It was the drama of paperwork and phone calls and legal processes that move at their own pace and require patience rather than courage. Hendricks filed the injunction. The county court clerk processed it. Tate coordinated between the sheriff's office, the DEA, and the AG's contact, who turned out to be a woman named Assistant Attorney General Patricia Voss, who had been watching Castellano's name appear in adjacent cases for 2 years, and who received the morning's package of documentation with the particular intensity of someone who has been waiting for a thread to pull and has finally been handed one. Ox spent the morning organizing what Potts had provided into a format that could be handed to investigators without requiring them to build a structure from scratch. He worked with the focused, methodical efficiency of a man who did this kind of organizing regularly enough to have a system, and he did it at a table in the safe house's kitchen while Ruth brought him coffee at intervals and didn't ask questions, which was its own kind of grace. Cole drove back to Kellner Creek twice during the day, once in the morning to sit with Millie for an hour and walk through the regulatory complaints Castellano had filed against the diner, each of which Hendricks had already flagged as retaliatory, and which the county's code enforcement office, once contacted by the AG's representative, began treating with conspicuously less urgency than they'd shown the previous afternoon. The second time in the afternoon, he went to Alora's apartment building on Clover Street. He called her from outside it. "I'm looking at your door," he said. "Okay," she said. "Tell me what's in the baby's room that you need." She closed her eyes. She'd been expecting this call and had been thinking about the answer to this question in the quiet intervals of the day. What was necessary? What was replaceable? What was the essential core of what she'd built in there? "The mobile," she said. "The one on the ceiling in the corner, over the crib. James and I picked the colors together. It's yellow and white. It has small birds on it. I need that." "Got it." The box on the kitchen counter, brown cardboard box, the lid is taped down. Inside it's James's things. Things he sent back from deployment and things from after. "I need that." "The box is the priority," Cole said. "What else?" She told him. The crib could stay too large for now. She'd retrieve it when the housing situation was resolved. The dresser too. What she needed was smaller clothing documents, the box, the mobile, the small blanket that had been her grandmother's that she kept on the back of the couch. The prenatal files in the folder on the kitchen table. Her laptop. He was back at the safe house 2 hours later with everything she'd listed. He set the box down on the kitchen table without ceremony. He'd wrapped the mobile carefully in a dish towel so nothing would get bent. She picked up the mobile and held it for a moment. The small yellow birds. The white wire frame James had called practical and charming, which was exactly the combination he'd been looking for in a child's bedroom fixture. "Thank you," she said. She was running out of ways to say it that felt adequate, but she kept saying it anyway because it was the truest thing available. "Don't," Cole said, not unkindly. "This is not charity. This is not favor. You understand that?" "I'm starting to," she said. At 4 in the afternoon, the first consequence arrived that wasn't procedural. Tate called Cole. Cole put the call on speaker at the kitchen table where Alora and Sandra were both sitting. Tate's voice was crisp and contained and slightly faster than his usual pace, which Alora had learned meant he was managing something he found satisfying. "We've executed a search warrant on Castellano's office," Tate said. "A G's office pushed it through this morning based on Potts's documentation. We're 3 hours into the search, and I can tell you that what's in those filing cabinets is consistent with everything Potts described and considerably more extensive." "How extensive?" Cole said. "I'm not going to give you details that could compromise the investigation," Tate said, "but I can tell you that the pattern we documented this morning is not limited to 2 prior investigations. The documentation in that office suggests activity going back at least 9 years and reaching into 6 Tennessee counties." A pause. "He's been doing this for 9 years. The table was quiet. "Is he in custody?" Alora said. "Not yet," Tate said. "The warrant is for the office. An arrest warrant requires a different threshold, and we're building to it." His attorney made an appearance at the AG's office at 2 o'clock this afternoon. "He's aware that the search is happening. Which means Castellano knows we have his files, Cole said. Yes, Tate said, which is why I'm calling. Ms. Whitmore's location needs to remain secure. His attorney is already claiming the investigation is being driven by organized crime pressure. They're going to try to build a narrative that discredits the primary witness. They're going to come at me, Alora said. Not a question, not even particularly alarmed, just clear-eyed about the sequence. They're going to try, Tate said. Legally in the media if they can manage it through whatever pressure points they can find. I want you to be ready for that. I've been ready for hard things for 11 months, she said. I'm not new to this. A brief pause on Tate's end. No, he said. I don't think you are. After the call, Sandra made coffee. Nobody said anything for a few minutes. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window, and the house was quiet in the way houses are quiet when the people in them are thinking. 9 years, Sandra said finally. He's been doing this for 9 years. Yes, Cole said. How many families, Sandra said. We don't know yet, Cole said. We'll know more when the AG's office finishes going through what's in his office. Sandra wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. She had the look of a woman who was performing the calculation of 9 years of families displaced and arriving at a number that made her jaw tighten. And the 2 prior investigations, she said. The witnesses who withdrew. Yes, Cole said. Were they pressured, Sandra said, the way Alora was pressured yesterday. Cole looked at her. Probably, he said. We'll know more when they can be found and asked. Sandra nodded. She looked at Alora. You were the first one who didn't back down, she said. Alora thought about that, about the moment in the diner when she told him she wasn't going to call him, about what that had cost, the slap, the eviction notice, the envelope, the letter about her parking lot, about what that refusal had set in motion. She thought about all the people who had backed down, who'd had every reason to back down, who'd been alone in the way she'd been alone for 11 months, but without 6 bikers walking through the door at the right moment. I almost did, she said honestly. Back down. There was a second when he first mentioned my building when I understood how much he knew. There was a second where I thought about just going along, just being compliant enough to make it stop. What stopped you? Sandra said. Alora looked at the box on the table, at the dog tags she could feel through her shirt. She put her hand on her stomach. James, she said simply, I thought about what he would have done, and then I didn't have to think anymore. At 6 that evening, Cole's phone rang again. He looked at the screen, and this time his face did something new. Not the surface calm, not the careful assessment, but something that was actually close to surprise, which she had not seen on him before. He answered, listened for 40 seconds, said when, listened again, said we'll be there, and hung up. He looked at Alora. Patricia Voss, he said, the AG's office. They want to meet with you tomorrow morning. Not at a police station, not at the AG's office, somewhere neutral. They want to discuss the broader investigation, all 6 counties, the full 9 years, everything in those files. Why me? Alora said. I'm one person in one county. Because you're the one who didn't back down, Cole said. Because your statement with the camera footage and the document trail and Potts's cooperation gives them the clearest chain of evidence they've had in 9 years of watching this man operate. He paused. And because you asked yesterday to make this about all of them, not just yourself. She looked at him. The weight of it, of what tomorrow meant, what the next weeks would require, what it would cost to be the person at the center of a 9-county investigation while 7 months pregnant and freshly evicted and still learning how to carry a grief she'd never had the space to put down properly. She felt all of it. She didn't flinch from it. Okay, she said. Tell me what time. Cole almost smiled. 8 a.m. Sandra stood up, refilled everyone's coffee without asking, and sat back down with the practicality of a woman who understood that big moments required the same small maintenance as ordinary ones. Then we go to bed at a reasonable hour, Sandra said, and we eat a proper dinner first, and tomorrow you go tell those people everything. Alora looked at her mother, at Cole, at the box on the table and the mobile wrapped carefully in a dish towel and the coffee her mother had made, and the room they were sitting in that belonged to a veteran named Earl, who had opened his home because someone had once opened a door for him. She thought about James walking through the doorway he wasn't supposed to walk through. She thought about what it gave. She thought about the child turning slowly inside her patient and present, waiting for the world that was being built around it by people who had decided it mattered. "Okay, Mom," she said, "let's eat." The meeting with Patricia Voss lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes, and by the end of it, Alora's back was aching, and her coffee had gone cold twice, and the Assistant Attorney General had filled 14 pages of a legal pad with notes in handwriting so small and dense that it looked like a language only she could read. They met at a conference room in the public library in the next town over, neutral ground, as promised, with no sheriff's vehicles outside and no obvious law enforcement presence, because Voss was thorough enough to understand that the appearance of coercion would give Castellano's attorneys something to work with. Cole was there. Hendricks drove up from Knoxville and arrived 7 minutes before the meeting started, slightly out of breath with a leather briefcase that looked like it had been through more courtrooms than most judges. Sandra sat in the corner with a cup of tea and said nothing and missed nothing. Alora talked for the first hour and a half without stopping, except to answer specific questions. She told it the way she'd told it to Tate, plainly, precisely, without performance. But this time she told all of it, including the months before yesterday. The things she hadn't connected until yesterday connected them for her. The rent increase in January. The way Gerald Potts had started becoming harder to reach after Castellano's company absorbed his management contract. The single conversation she'd had with the neighbor, Mrs. Elaine Dupree, who'd moved out of the Clover Street building in February, citing vague personal reasons that Alora now understood were not personal at all. When she mentioned Mrs. Dupree, Voss looked up from her notepad. "Elaine Dupree," she said, "of 14B Clover Street." "Yes," Alora said. "Do you know her?" "Her name is in Potts's documentation," Voss said. "She received a cash settlement in February. $1,200 to vacate without contest." Voss paused. The unit she left rented 2 weeks later for $400 more per month than she'd been paying. Alora thought about Elaine Dupree, who had been 67 and had lived in that building for 11 years and who had stopped to talk to Alora in the hallway one afternoon in January and said quietly that she was thinking about moving closer to her daughter, that the building didn't feel the same as it used to, that she didn't know how to explain it, but that something had changed. Alora had thought she meant the ownership transition. She had meant something more specific and more deliberate. "Where is she now?" Alora said. "With her daughter in Memphis," Voss said, which as it turns out was not her preference but her only available option. She looked at Alora over the top of her notepad. "She's on my list to contact this week." The second hour covered the documentation Ox's property analysis. Potts's files, the Delaware trust structure, the 9 years of patterns that Voss had been assembling from fragments and could now for the first time see whole. Hendricks walked her through the legal architecture of the retaliatory eviction claim and the assault charge and the criminal threatening charge with the efficiency of a man who had spent 40 years turning injustice into language that courts could act on. Voss listened and asked precise questions and wrote and wrote and wrote. At the 2-hour mark, she set her pen down. "I want to tell you where we are," she said, looking at Alora directly, "and I want to be honest with you about what's going to be hard." "Please," Alora said. "Victor Castellano will be arrested," Voss said. "I can't give you a date, but the evidence we have from his office, combined with Potts's cooperation and your documented case, meets the threshold for criminal charges on multiple counts: criminal threatening assault, organized fraud, and what the statutes call unlawful property acquisition through coercion, which carries significant sentencing weight in this state." She paused. "His attorneys are already building a defense. They will attempt to characterize the investigation as politically motivated. They will attempt to discredit Potts as a cooperating witness with personal liability. And they will. I am telling you this directly so you are not surprised. Attempt to build a narrative around your connection to Cole and the other men who were present yesterday, implying that the events of that morning were staged or provoked." Alora looked at her steadily. "They're going to say I was planted there." "They're going to try," Voss said, "which is why the camera footage is as important as it is. Your employment at Millie's goes back 3 years. The bikers' presence was incidental to their route. The timeline is documented and unambiguous." She picked up her pen again. "They will try. They will not succeed. But I want you to know it's coming so that when it arrives, you're not destabilized by it." "I won't be," Alora said. Voss looked at her for a moment. Then she made a small sound, not quite a laugh, something warmer and more tired than a laugh, and said, "No, I don't think you will be." Cole, who had been quiet through most of the meeting, said from his end of the table, "The other families. The 11 in this county, however many in the other 5. What's the process for getting them into the investigation? Hendricks and I will coordinate on that, Voss said. We'll need to locate and contact each of them, establish their willingness to participate, and assess what documentation exists for each case. She looked at Alora. That process is going to move more slowly than your individual case. I want to be honest about that. I know, Alora said, but it needs to happen. It will happen, Voss said. And she said it in the flat, factual tone of a woman who had been building cases for 22 years and understood the difference between a promise and a statement of intent and intended this to be both. They broke up at 11:40. In the parking lot afterward, with the November air sharp enough to see breath, Hendricks shook Alora's hand with both of his and said, "You did very well in there. You gave her everything she needed and nothing she didn't, and that is a skill most people never develop." He paused. "I've been doing this work for 40 years. The cases that win are not always the ones with the most evidence. They're the ones where the primary witness is completely, clearly, unmistakably credible." He looked at her. "You are the most credible primary witness I have had in recent memory." She thanked him. She meant it. He got in his car and drove back to Knoxville. In the parking lot with Sandra talking quietly to Cole near the cars, Alora stood still for a moment and let the cold air move through her. 7 months and 3 weeks. The baby had been particularly active since morning. She'd been aware of it throughout the meeting. The rolling pressure that was somehow both reassuring and comic, the child participating in its own way in the most consequential morning of its mother's life. She pressed her hand to her side where the movement was strongest. "I know," she said quietly. "We did okay." The 10 days that followed were not easy, but they had the quality of difficulty that is survivable because it has direction. Every hard thing had a next step, and the next step had a person responsible for it, and the people responsible were doing their jobs. It was a revelation, she realized somewhat embarrassingly, the revelation that this was what it felt like when systems worked, when institutions functioned as intended, when the people inside them had not been compromised or worn down or purchased. She had spent 11 months fighting systems that moved at their own pace regardless of her needs. Now she was inside one that was moving because people with authority were pushing it. The eviction notice was invalidated on day 3. The county court judge who heard Hendricks's injunction request took 11 minutes to grant it and used the word egregious to describe the timing of the notice relative to the police report, which Hendricks later told Alora was not a word judges use casually in written rulings. Gerald Potts, upon receiving notice of the injunction, fired his attorney and hired a different one, a woman from Nashville who specialized in cooperation agreements, which told everyone involved everything they needed to know about how Potts was calculating his options. On day 5, Victor Castellano's attorneys filed a motion in the county court to have the eviction case transferred to a different jurisdiction, citing bias in the local judiciary. The motion was denied in 48 hours. His attorneys then released a statement to 2 regional news outlets characterizing the investigation as a coordinated campaign of harassment by criminal elements against a legitimate businessman, which was the narrative Voss had warned Alora was coming and which landed in the regional news cycle with about a quarter of the impact Castellano had apparently expected, because someone Alora was fairly certain it was Ox, though she never asked directly, had provided those same news outlets with the property records, the timeline, and a summary of the Delaware trust structure on the same day the statement was released. So the first story about the legitimate businessman ran alongside a second story about a 9-county property fraud investigation. And the juxtaposition did the work that any editorial comment would have done less effectively. On day 7, Alora moved back into her apartment on Clover Street. Not because it was ideal, the legal situation around the building's ownership was still being untangled, and Hendricks had made clear that the longer-term resolution might involve a different address. But because the injunction protected her tenancy, because her medical files and her routine and her prenatal appointments and the yellow walls were there, and because going back was an act of refusal that felt important. Victor Castellano had tried to remove her from her home. She was going back to her home. Cole drove her. She didn't ask him to. He offered briefly in the way he offered things without elaboration or pressure, and she accepted. They carried things up in 2 trips. He carried the box, which he handled with the same careful deliberateness he'd brought to everything. She carried the mobile still wrapped in the dish towel. He helped her rehang it in the baby's room, standing on the step stool she used to reach the ceiling hook adjusting the wire until it balanced the way it had before. She stood back and watched it spin. The small yellow birds moved in the air from the heating vent, exactly as she'd left them. "Good," she said. Cole stepped down from the stool. He looked at the mobile for a moment, then around the room, the yellow walls, the crib, the dresser James had chosen from a catalog on a video call, and his face held something she recognized as a man looking at a thing that matters and knowing it. "He would have been proud of this room," Cole said. "He picked the dresser," she said. "Of course he did." She laughed. It surprised her, the real unguarded quality of it, the way it came from somewhere uncomplicated. She hadn't laughed like that in a long time. She noticed the noticing of it. On day 9, Victor Castellano was arrested. She heard it from Cole, who called her at 7:40 in the morning while she was eating breakfast, which her mother had made before driving back to Knoxville the day before, with the specific, satisfied reluctance of a woman who was certain her daughter was all right and still wished she could stay. "It happened at 6 this morning," Cole said. "His home address. 2 AGs, investigators, and 2 sheriff's deputies. He was in custody by 6:15. She set down her fork. "How many charges?" "7 counts, Cole said. Assault, criminal, threatening organized fraud, 2 counts of unlawful property acquisition through coercion, 1 count related to the structure of the Delaware Trust, and 1 count connected to the Bradley County investigation 4 years ago. Voss found a witness from that case who's now willing to testify." She sat with that for a moment. 7 counts. The Bradley County witness, someone who had backed down before, who had watched 4 years pass, who had apparently found something in the news of this investigation that made it possible to come forward. "The witness from Bradley County," she said. "Who told them about the investigation?" "The news coverage," Cole said. "The second story, the one that ran alongside Castellano's statement." She thought about Ox, who she'd never asked. She thought about information placed in the right hands at the right moment. She thought about the machinery of accountability, how it required not just the formal apparatus of law, but the informal apparatus of people paying attention and acting on what they saw. "Is he going to make bail?" she said. "His attorneys filed the application this morning," Cole said. "Voss is opposing it. Given the flight risk assessment and the multi-county nature of the charges, she thinks she can hold him." A pause. "I want to be honest with you, he may make bail regardless. Men with his resources usually find a way. But if he does, the conditions are going to include a no-contact order and geographic restrictions, and he'll be under the kind of scrutiny that makes it very hard to operate the way he has been." "Okay," she said. "That's okay." "You sound calm," Cole said. "I am calm," she said. And it was true, which surprised her slightly. She'd expected this moment to feel more bigger, more cathartic, more like the ending of something. Instead, it felt like a step in a sequence, significant and real, but not the end of the story. The end of the story was not Castellano's arrest. The end of the story was Elaine Dupree in Memphis and the 11 families in the 6 counties and the 9 years of people who had been moved like pieces on a board they hadn't known they were on. "Cole," she said. "Yeah." "The other families," she said. "Voss said it would be slower. Have there been any contacts made yet?" "Hendricks reached 3 of them yesterday," Cole said. 2 are willing to participate. The third needs more time. One of the 3, a couple named Garrett, had a house in the next county over, sold it in 2022, under pressure for $30,000, below market. They've been renting since then and paying more per month than their mortgage would have been." He paused. "They're coming forward." She closed her eyes for a moment. The Garretts, a couple she'd never met in a county she'd never lived in, who had been moved out of their home 2 years ago by the same machinery that had tried to move her out of hers, and who were now coming forward because she hadn't backed down in a diner on a Thursday morning. "Good," she said. "That's good." 3 weeks after the morning in Millie's Corner Diner, Alora Whitmore went into labor at 4:17 in the afternoon on a Wednesday in the apartment on Clover Street, with her mother on the phone telling her to breathe and a hospital bag she'd packed 2 weeks early because she was a woman who believed in being ready. The labor lasted 11 hours. She had 2 people in the room with her for the parts that mattered to her mother, who held her hand through the final hours with the steady, wordless persistence that only mothers can provide, and a labor nurse named Cheryl who had been doing this for 26 years and who talked to Laura through the hard sections with the calm authority of someone who has accompanied more people through the worst and best of themselves than she could count. She did not think about Victor Castellano. She did not think about eviction notices or Delaware trusts or the AG's office or depositions or any of the complicated machinery that was still turning in the background of her life. She thought about James. She talked to him quietly in the spaces between the hardest moments in the way she'd learned to talk to him over 11 months of talking to absence. She told him she had it. She told him she was okay. She told him the room was yellow, the dresser was solid wood, the mobile was spinning. She told him he would have been extraordinary at this. At 3:41 in the morning, a boy was born. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, lungs that made their presence emphatically known. Dark hair, which surprised her and then didn't because James had dark hair, and she should have expected it. The nurse put him on her chest and he stopped crying almost immediately and opened his eyes unfocused, new-taking in a world he had no framework for yet. And Alora looked at him and felt something she did not have adequate words for, something that was made of grief and love and fury and hope in proportions that no sentence could accurately carry. "Hi," she said. "Hi, baby, I'm your mom." He blinked. "Your dad was the best man I ever knew," she said. "You're going to hear a lot about him. I'm going to make sure of it." Her mother, who had been doing very well up to this point, did not do very well for the next several minutes. That was all right. Some things earn their tears. She named him James Cole Whitmore. She had decided on this name 6 days earlier, quietly, without consulting anyone. She'd thought about it for a long time, not the James part that had never been a question that had been decided before he was born in any framework she'd ever imagined for the future. The Cole part had been slower. It wasn't gratitude exactly. Gratitude was too transactional a word for what she was trying to honor. It was something more like acknowledgement, the understanding that some connections are not accidental, that some people show up at the exact intersection of debt and need and timing because the universe on its better days has a kind of structure to it that looks like coincidence, only if you don't stand back far enough to see the whole shape. Cole Kincaid had stood in a doorway for 23 years with a debt he couldn't pay to the man who'd saved his life. The universe had sent him to a diner in Kellner Creek, Tennessee on a Thursday morning and given him a way to pay it. That was worth a name. She told Cole by text the morning after the birth. Short because she was exhausted and because some things don't need many words. "He's here, 7 pounds, 4 ounces. His name is James Cole Whitmore. I thought you should know first." His response came 4 minutes later. 3 words. "Thank you, Alora." She read those 3 words and set the phone down and looked at the baby in the bassinet beside her bed, sleeping with the total uncomplicated commitment that only very new people can manage. "You have good people in your corner already," she told him. "More than you know." Castellano's bail was denied. Voss had argued it effectively, the multi-county pattern, the documented history of witness intimidation, the Bradley County witness, the flight risk profile of a man with the financial resources to disappear if he chose to. The judge agreed with language that Hendricks described as unusually pointed for a bail denial, which in legal terms meant the judge was saying what he thought of the defendant without saying it directly. The preliminary hearing was set for January. Potts had signed his cooperation agreement. The Garretts and the second family from Hendricks's contacts had retained attorneys of their own coordinated through the same network that had connected Alora to Hendricks, and their documentation was being integrated into what Voss's office was now treating as a consolidated multi-county case. The Bradley County witness had given a formal deposition that Hendricks described as devastating, which was his highest register of approval. In the 3rd week after the birth, on a Saturday morning, Cole came to Kellner Creek. Not for anything legal, not for strategy or documentation or coordination with the AG's office. He came because Alora had asked him to, and because he had told her he would tell her everything, and there were still things she hadn't heard yet, and because James Cole Whitmore was 19 days old and had not yet met one of the people his name was built from. He sat in the chair beside the couch, and she sat on the couch with the baby in her arms, and the apartment was quiet and warm, with November light coming through the window, and he told her stories for 2 hours. The good ones, the terrible jokes, the worn paperback, the way James had talked about home, with the precise, specific love of a man who knew exactly what he was fighting for. He told her the one about the goat that had appeared mysteriously in their FOB in week 3 that James had decided belonged to the unit, and that the unit commander had decided absolutely did not belong to the unit, and the 3 days of diplomatic negotiation that followed, which James had lost technically, but won in spirit. She laughed until the baby startled and looked at her with the affronted expression of someone who had been resting peacefully and found this unreasonable. "Sorry," she told him. That was a good story. Cole watched the baby with an expression she'd never seen on him before, open unguarded with the particular quality of a man looking at something new in the world and finding that the world is in this specific instance genuinely okay. He looks like him, Cole said, around the eyes. I know, she said. I noticed that first thing. A pause, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't need filling. How are you doing? Cole said. Actually, she considered the question with the seriousness it deserved because he was asking it the way he'd always asked things, plainly wanting the real answer. I'm tired, she said, in a way that goes past sleep deprivation, though there's plenty of that too. I'm still processing. There are days when everything that happened, the diner, all of it feels like it happened to someone else, and days when it feels like it happened this morning. She looked at the baby. But I'm not afraid. That's the thing I keep coming back to. I went a long time being afraid, in a low-grade way, of all the things that could still go wrong. And I'm not afraid anymore. I don't know exactly when that changed. I think I do, Cole said. She looked at him. When you told Castellano you weren't going to call him on him, Cole said, I watched it happen from across the room. You made a decision in that moment, I could see it, and the decision wasn't about him. It was about who you were going to be in that situation. And once a person makes that decision, the fear changes. It doesn't go away, but it changes into something you can use. She sat with that for a moment. She thought he was right. She thought it had been that moment, the one where she'd understood what he was and what he wanted, and had chosen without quite planning to choose to be someone who didn't give it to him. James made that kind of decision, she said. In Fallujah, he wasn't supposed to come through that doorway. No, Cole said, but he did. Yes. Because someone needed him to, she said. Not because it was safe or tactical or within his assignment. Just because someone needed him, and he was the one who could. Cole nodded slowly. That's exactly why. She looked at the baby who had fallen back asleep with the specific total ease of someone with no outstanding concerns. That's who he comes from, she said. That's the inheritance. The investigation moved forward through the winter. Castellano's trial was set for spring, then delayed by his attorneys to summer, which Hendricks said was predictable, and Voss said was fine because every week of delay was a week of additional documentation being assembled and additional witnesses finding the courage to come forward. By January 8, families across 4 counties had joined the consolidated case. By February, that number was 11. By March 14. The first Voss called to Laura about directly was a woman named Rose Tanner from a county 2 hours east who had been pushed out of a property her family had owned for 3 generations, a farmhouse 20 acres. The kind of land that holds a family's history in every fence post and field through a manufactured tax irregularity and a predatory buyout structured by Castellano's Delaware Trust. Rose Tanner was 73. She had signed the buyout agreement in a lawyer's office on a loan without independent counsel, while a representative of Castellano's LLC held the pen out to her and told her the alternative was foreclosure. She had been living in a rental unit since paying more than she'd ever paid to live anywhere with the settlement money drained by the first 18 months of rent. Alora talked to Rose Tanner on the phone for an hour and 40 minutes. Rose was quiet and precise and had the specific kind of anger that very old wrongs produce, not hot, not loud, but deep and settled, and completely without the energy to forgive. She had kept every document, every letter, every notice, 3 years of paper in a shoebox because something in her had known, even when she'd signed, that the truth existed in those pages and that truth mattered even when no one was looking at it. I didn't think anyone would come, Rose said near the end of the call. I thought it was just me. I thought I'd made a mistake, and I was just going to have to live with it. You didn't make a mistake, Alora said. He made you believe you didn't have options. That's different. A silence on Rose's end. You're young, Rose said finally. 31, Alora said. That's young, Rose said. You have time to do a lot of good with this. Alora looked across the room at the baby who was in the bouncer chair Sandra had brought on her last visit awake and conducting what appeared to be a serious examination of his own hands. I intend to, she said. Victor Castellanos' trial began on a Tuesday in June. It lasted 3 weeks. The defense did exactly what Voss had predicted. The organized crime narrative, the staged incident, claims the attack on Potts' credibility as a cooperating witness with personal liability. Castellano's attorney was skilled and expensive and worked hard for every day of those 3 weeks. It wasn't enough. The camera footage was 14 minutes of unambiguous truth, and it had been authenticated by 3 independent technical experts, and there was nothing in it that could be reframed or contextualized into something other than what it was. The documentation of the property fraud was 9 years of records assembled by the AG's office, with Potts's cooperation and the additional documentation provided by 14 families who had kept their paperwork in shoeboxes and kitchen drawers and the backs of filing cabinets because something in them had known the truth mattered. The Bradley County witness, a man named David Kearns, 61, who had watched his business forced to close 4 years ago and had been living with the knowledge that he'd backed down from testifying, carrying that knowledge the way you carry things you're not proud of until the Tuesday morning. He'd read the news story and called Voss's office from his kitchen, gave testimony on day 9 of the trial that the courtroom received in the particular silence that truth produces when it's delivered by someone who has waited a long time to tell it and is now fully committed to telling all of it. Alora testified on day 11. She wore the dog tags. She thought about it, whether it was appropriate, whether it was too much, whether it communicated something that would be used against her in some way. She wore them anyway because they were true, and she had decided that everything she brought into that courtroom was going to be true. She was on the stand for 4 hours. Direct examination from Voss's second chair, cross-examination from Castellano's attorney, who was skilled and precise and found approximately nothing to work with. She answered every question in the same register. She'd always answered difficult questions, plainly, precisely, without performance, with the complete and total credibility that Hendricks had identified in the library conference room 7 months ago. She looked at Castellano once during the cross-examination when his attorney was implying that the events of that morning had been coordinated. She looked at him the way you look at something you understand completely and are not afraid of, and she answered the question, and she didn't look at him again. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty on 6 of 7 counts. The 7th, the most technical of the fraud counts related to a specific filing in the Delaware Trust, was a hung count that Voss's office said they would retry, and that Hendricks said the guilty verdicts on the 6 remaining counts made largely academic in terms of sentencing. Victor Castellano was sentenced 14 weeks later to 19 years in federal prison, reduced through the mechanics of sentencing guidelines to an effective minimum of 12 years before parole eligibility, but with conditions that Voss described as designed to make early parole as difficult as legally achievable. Alora heard the sentencing from Hendricks on a phone call standing in the kitchen of the apartment on Clover Street, watching her son sit in his bouncer and investigate a plastic ring with the focused intensity of a person encountering a significant object for the first time. She thanked Hendricks. She set the phone down. She picked up James Cole Whitmore from the bouncer and held him against her shoulder and stood in the apartment on Clover Street that she had not been evicted from, in the life that had not been taken from her, and she let herself feel the full weight of everything that had happened and everything that hadn't happened and everything that was still ahead. Millie's Corner Diner held a small gathering that evening. Not a celebration exactly. Millie didn't hold with the concept of celebrating consequences as though they were victories, since consequences were simply what happened when truth was brought to bear on power, which was the minimum the world owed to everyone in it. But she opened the diner after closing and made biscuits, and there was coffee, and there were people who had earned the right to be in the same room together with the knowledge of what they'd done. Cole was there, Ox and Danny and the others, Tate, Donna, who cried briefly and managed it with efficiency. Hendricks drove up from Knoxville again, this time without the briefcase. Sandra came down from Knoxville for the 2nd time in a week, which she described as a coincidence of scheduling and which fooled no one. Millie sat at her counter stool and drank her coffee and looked around the room at the people in it with the expression of a woman who has lived long enough to know that the world contains both the worst of what people do to each other and the best, and that the ratio is not fixed, and that on certain specific evenings in the right rooms with the right people, the ratio tilts in a direction worth marking. Alora sat at the corner table, the same table where Cole had first sat across from her 9 months ago, and asked her to tell him what she meant with her son in her arms and Cole beside her and her mother across from her. And she thought about James. She thought about what he'd said in a different context, in a different world, about the people who decide to have you and what that means. These are the people who have you, not because they're supposed to, because they decided to. She looked at Cole. He would have wanted to be here, she said. He is, Cole said, and he said it simply without sentimentality as a statement of what he believed, and she received it the same way. James Cole Whitmore made a sound against her shoulder, not a word, not yet, just a sound, the kind that very new people make when they are present and comfortable and aware, in whatever way new people are aware that they are where they are supposed to be. She pressed her lips to the top of his head. He came into a world that had tried to break his mother before he was born, and his mother had not broken. He came with his father's name and a second name that carried the weight of a debt paid and a life given back. He came into a room full of people who had decided not because they were supposed to, but because they chose to, that his family was worth protecting. A Marine walked through a doorway in Fallujah to save a man's life. 23 years later, that man walked across a diner floor to save the Marine's family. And the child born from that chain of choices came into the world held by people who understood that some debts are not transactional, they are permanent, they are transferred, they move through time in ways that cannot be predicted or planned, and they always find their way home. James Cole Whitmore was that homecoming, and he would spend his whole life growing into the legacy that had built the room around him, a room made of honor of chosen family, of the stubborn, unbreakable insistence that the right thing is always worth doing, even when the cost is real, even when no one is watching, even when the only reason to do it is that it is simply completely and undeniably right. That was his inheritance, and it was more than enough.